Good morning. Well, first of all, let me thank SEAMEO RETRAC for the invitation to come and do this plenary speech. Actually, I've done quite a lot of plenary speeches for SEAMEO RETRAC. I think my first one was in 2015, and I think this is about my fourth one. It's a real pleasure to be back in Ho Chi Minh for all the reasons that Toni said. The food is great, the shopping is great, and the people are friendly. Okay, and my topic is L2 pragmatic development in a classroom context. In a lot of my other plenary talks here, I tended to make them very teacher-oriented. This one is actually going to be a little bit more research-oriented, and it's going to talk about two studies that I have conducted at different times during my long career, investigating pragmatic development in a classroom context. Looks like we can get going. First of all, what is pragmatics? When researchers talk about pragmatics, they make a distinction between two aspects of it, what they call pragmalinguistics and what they call socio-pragmatics. Pragmalinguistics really refers to the knowledge of the language that you can use in order to behave pragmatically. So it relates to the linguistic strategies that you need in order, for example, to produce a polite request. So if you want to produce a polite request, you would not say, I want you to. You would say, I was wondering if you would. Socio-pragmatics concerns the social variables, the social factors that you need to take into account when choosing pragmalinguistic resources, etc. And very often, these variables are defined in terms of power, distance, and imposition. Power is the relationship between you and the person you're speaking to. If I'm speaking to my head of school, he is in a more powerful position than I am, so I have a need to be a little bit polite, etc. Distance, whether you know each other very well, whether you've spent a lot of time interacting together and you're familiar with each other. And imposition, the extent to which you're asking something important or not so important. For example, if you're asking your father to borrow a lot of money, that would be very important, a big imposition. If you're asking your father for a very small loan until the end of the month, that would not be such a big imposition. So it's all connected really with the idea of politeness. And typically two politeness strategies are identified. What is called a positive politeness strategy and a negative strategy. I can give you an example from my experience of the many emails that I get from people that I don't know. When they want to ask me for something. They might want to ask me to send them an article, or they might want me to look at something that they are planning to research and they want my comments. And they don't start off with the request straight away. They start off with a long paragraph saying what a marvelous person I am. I have read all your works. We are so grateful for everything that you have done, etc., etc. And then, after one paragraph of saying what a marvelous person I am, then they come up with their request. Could you please help me with my, etc. So what they are doing is using a positive politeness strategy, softening me up, making me feel good, and then moving on to a negative strategy, etc., right? And this happens a lot more in some cultures than other cultures. It happens a lot more in Asian cultures than it does if I get an email from someone in Europe or someone in America. Now, what I'm interested in is how do people develop pragmatic competence in a classroom environment. And what we know is that actually this is very problematic. Edmondson drew on Labov's observer's paradox. Now, the observer's paradox said that if you want to research what someone does naturally, you can't do it by observing them. Because once you start to observe them, they will not perform naturally. And you could say that the same thing happens in the school, that we seek in the classroom to teach people how to talk when they are not being taught. Think about what that means. Yeah, we try to teach people how to talk, right? But what we want them to do is to learn to communicate in a way that has nothing to do with how they were taught. Once you start to teach people, it actually is very difficult to actually get them to behave in a pragmatically appropriate way. And one of the reasons for this is what is known as IRF exchanges. IRF exchanges refer to the idea that the teacher starts off by initiating something, either by making a request to the student or asking a question, and then the student responds, and then the teacher follows up by evaluating the teacher's response. Good. And what researchers have suggested is that this kind of exchange, which is really dominant in classrooms, affords very few opportunities for extended utterances. It limits the range of language functions to be performed, and it provides a few occasions for communication breakdown and dealing with communication breakdown. And here's a quotation from one of my old friends, no longer with us, sadly, Leah Van Leer. And he said, in the IRF exchange, the student's response is hemmed in, squeezed between a demand to display knowledge and a judgment on its competence. So what he's really saying is it limits your opportunity to learn the language. And in particular, it limits your ability to develop pragmatic competence in a language. Seedhouse said much the same. He said, as soon as the teacher instructs the learners to have a conversation in English, the institutional purpose will be invoked and the interaction cannot become a conversation. To replicate conversation, the lesson would have to cease to be a lesson in any understood sense of the term. So what they are saying again is that true conversational exchanges are very difficult to achieve in a classroom context, and pragmatic competence is very difficult to develop in a classroom context. I'm now going, with that introduction, I'm now going to talk about my two studies. Now, these two studies actually were both done by myself, and they span a very large part of my life. You can see that the first one is 1992, but actually the research for this was completed in 1982. And then the other study that I'm going to talk about was actually completed this year. So you're looking at the two, almost the beginning and the end of my career as a sort of researcher. These are the research questions that I addressed in the 1992 study. Do L2 classroom learners manifest stages of development in the acquisition of requests? How do they acquire requests? Do they go through some kind of developmental process? And two, does an L2 classroom context provide opportunities for learners to acquire target-like requests? These were learning in a classroom, and I wanted to know whether after a substantial period of time, they had developed the ability to produce requests that were polite. And in fact, the study lasted 6 school terms, almost 2 years. So I'm going to look at what they were capable of doing in making requests at the beginning what they were like at the end, and ask how far had they gone in actually learning to make requests in a pragmatically appropriate way. This study was actually carried out in London. So these were ESL learners, not EFL learners. Now, you would think with the ESL learners, they have lots of opportunities for developing pragmatic ability because they are immersed in the language outside the classroom. But this is not true with beginner level learners who are living with the family that they came to live with they're living with their own family. And so they are speaking their own native language at home. So there's not much opportunity for them interacting. One was Portuguese, a 10-year-old boy, and the other was a Pakistan boy, 11 years old. They were both more or less complete beginners, and they varied a bit. Jay was a very confident learner. R was not such a confident learner. This was the instructional setting. It was what's called a language center. Language centers were very common in London then. And when immigrants came to live in Britain and they didn't know any English, the children were placed in a language center, the purpose of which was try to develop some sort of basic competence in English before they were moved to a normal secondary school. So they were placed in a small class which was very mixed. Learners from very different backgrounds speaking very different first languages. The classrooms were very informal, so there ought to have been lots of opportunities for communicating quite naturally. This is the data that I collected. I visited the learner's classroom at least once every 2 weeks, and I recorded the learner's utterances in 2 ways. I used pencil and paper, writing down what they said, together with information of the context in which they said it, and I also audio recorded them. I then identified all terms that included a request produced by each learner. So I went through my data, 2 years of data, and identified all the utterances that involved a request, an attempt to make some type of request. And there was my definition of what I mean by a request: a speech act whose illocutionary purpose was to ask another person to perform some non-verbal action. Then I set about analyzing the requests. And actually, there's a lot of literature on how to analyze requests, and I drew on this literature. And I identified 3 basic types of requests. One is what are called direct requests, and there are subcategories of those. There is a move derivable, such as "you shut up" or "give it me." Performative: I'm telling you to shut up. I'm telling you not to do that. Hedge performance: I'd like to ask you to shut up. And what's called a location derivable: I want it, I need it, I must have it, etc. And then we move to conventionally direct, and this can be done partly with a suggestion. So let's play a game. Or it can be done using the verb can. Can you draw? Can you draw it? Can I have a? Etc. And finally, they were non-conventionally direct, such as strong hints. At one time, one of these children said, "This paper is not very good to color blue." And what she wanted was a new piece of paper. So she was indicating that the piece of paper that she had was no good for what she wanted. It was an indirect request to get a new piece of paper. Strong hint or weak hint: it's not good for drawing, right? Same thing. So direct, conventionally direct, non-conventionally direct. So what we found was that the move derivable requests, dominated in both learners. And then, so in other words, things like involving verb imperative, give me, give me a pencil. I want were much more common. And then slowly, query preparatory begin to appear. Can you draw it? Can I have it? And all other request types, even after 2 years, occurred very, very rarely. So in this classroom context, basically, all that we were getting was very direct types of requests and a few conventionally direct requests, such as query preparatory. It was quite clear that there was some kind of developmental sequence going on. Requests for goods were first performed by means of verbless utterances. Well, when these children first made requests, they didn't even use a verb. They would just say, pencil, please, paper, color, etc., for something that they wanted. Then slowly, the mood derivable requests begin to appear with an imperative verb. Give me a paper, give me a color, give me a book. And then the formulaic expression, can I have, appeared. And this was true for both of them. They all appeared in this order. But alternative ways of requesting goods appeared only much later, months later. And it also took some time for can I to appear in a range of syntactic frames. Initially, all they could say was, can I have her? Can I have her? Can I have her? Right? But eventually they managed to be able to say, can I take a book with me? Etc. And even later, to substitute questions directed at the person they're speaking to, can you help me with this? Etc. Instead of saying, can I, they moved on to saying, can you? And this was a very clear pattern of development, very slow, very gradual. So my conclusion is that even after looking at what was going on for 2 years, there was only very limited development. They were limited in a number of ways. The majority of their requests were still only of the direct kind. And there were very few examples of non-conventional requests and very few hints. Certain types of requests, such as performatives and hedge performatives, did not occur at all. The range of formal devices was still very limited. They didn't move from saying, can I, to even the slightly more polite, could I? They got kind of stuck on the can I. There was no attempt to employ either internal or external modification. We can use internal modification by saying, would it be possible if, using words like possible, right? Or we can modify statements by saying, I think it would be, etc. Very, 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 didn't occur, basically. The learners failed to modify their choice of request strategy according to addressee. So I looked to see how they were speaking to the teacher and how they were speaking to other students. And I thought, well, you know, maybe they were being a bit more polite to teacher than to other students. Were they? No, they weren't. So, conclusion, after 2 years, these students had not really developed much pragmatic competence, very limited is that the learners were still in the process of acquiring the pragmalinguistic that they needed in order to perform requests. So one conclusion would be, it takes you longer than 2 years to really develop pragmatically polite ways of doing requests. You tend to rely on very simple, direct ways. So according to that explanation, the ability to perform requests in a pragmatically appropriate way is a very slow, gradual process. And remember, this is in an ESL situation in London. What would it be like in Vietnam if you were looking at what was happening in Vietnam? Another explanation, this is the one that I actually favor, is that the reason they did not develop a great variety of ways of performing requests had to do with the classroom and the nature of the classroom. That there's something about classrooms that actually makes it very difficult to develop polite ways of doing a request. And to explain this, I try to suggest that I try to distinguish three types of needs: what I call interpersonal need, which is when you have a basic need to perform a request, to request something of someone, an expressive need, where you don't want to do the request in exactly the same way all the time. You want to change the way that you make the request, much as the way that you don't want to wear the same clothes every day. You have an expressive need to change how you dress every day. You have a kind of expressive need to vary the language that you use a bit. And then there's a sociolinguistic need, which is the learner has the need to vary the use of the formal means at his disposal in order to match the situational factors, etc. So what I'm going to argue is that in the classroom, it's very difficult to go beyond expressive need. Yes, you can create interpersonal need, and that's satisfied with very direct requests. Yes, a little bit of expressive need because you want to vary the way in which you do it. But sociolinguistic need doesn't exist in the classroom. Very, very difficult to achieve. So that's my first study. And my first study, published in 1992, basically argued that the nature of classrooms and the nature of interaction that takes place in the classrooms makes it very, very difficult for learners to develop pragmatic competence. And in fact, that is a finding that has been replicated in many other studies as well. This study is perhaps more suited in a way to the opportunity. Well, I am talking about opportunities and challenges, definitely. The challenge of developing pragmatic competence in a classroom environment, right? Now I'm talking about opportunities. This was done this year, this particular study. And as you can see, the actual instruction was digital. It was actually carried out on a computer-based study. So I didn't go into classrooms. I was simply looking at the pragmatic competence of a group of learners. What I was interested in this time was, can we teach people to be pragmatically competent? Can we give them instruction in how to be pragmatically competent? And if we give them instruction, does that instruction actually work, right? There were two key questions that Gabby Casper asked. Is it necessary to teach pragmatics? Can pragmatics be taught? She concluded that pragmatics can be taught. And in fact, there has been a lot of research that has investigated the teaching of pragmatics. In order to talk about the teaching of pragmatics, you have to have a clear understanding of different ways in which you do it. So instruction can be divided up into whether it's explicit or whether it's implicit. Explicit instruction is where you basically deliberately focus the student's attention on some particular linguistic feature that you want them to learn. Implicit is where you expose them repeatedly to what it is you want them to learn in the hope that they will learn it and pick it up incidentally. Explicit instruction can be deductive. You give a rule, such as if you want to be very polite when you are requesting something, you can start off by saying, I was wondering if, etc. And you teach them the different ways in which they can make polite requests. Inductive is, again, explicit, but this time you don't actually give them rules. You expose them to examples and you ask them to kind of work out the rule for themselves, work out how to decide what is a polite way to make a request, what is not such a polite way. And these are the three definitions of the types of instruction, which I have just mentioned. A lot of research that is actually looked at meta-analyses. This is a study by Ren, Lee, and Liu. They looked at 29 studies. I don't know if you know what meta-analyses are. Meta-analyses are where you go and find all the studies that have investigated some particular thing you're interested in. In this case, the teaching of pragmatics. And then you investigate what these studies actually show. There are statistical techniques for working out what they show. And what this particular meta-analysis showed was that instruction has a large effect size. It works. That there's a greater effect in foreign language than second language settings. This is an interesting one. That in a setting like Vietnam, direct instruction of pragmatics is more likely to be effective than it is in a second language situation, like learning English in America or New Zealand or Australia. The effect is slightly larger for explicit instruction than implicit instruction. In other words, if you give people rules or you help them to understand rules, work them out for themselves, that works better than simple exposure. There's a greater effect for perception than production. You can basically get learners to understand what is polite and what is not polite, but it's much more difficult to actually teach them to use polite forms in an appropriate situation, to produce them. And the effect was varied according to how learning was measured. And one of the ways in which they've been measured was made by means of a discourse completion task. In this kind of task, they're given a situation, and then they're asked what they would say in this situation, and they have to write down what they would say in that particular situation. And obviously, if you're giving someone a situation and asking them to write down, then they're going to think very carefully about what they're going to do, right? It's not going to be very spontaneous language use. It's going to show what they can do very carefully. If you are conducting a study, such as our study, you do have to give a lot of thought to how you measure the learning outcomes. How do we decide whether any learning takes place as a result of the instruction? Because by and large, the kinds of tests that have been used in the research to date, such as the discourse completion test, are much more likely to measure explicit processing. Explicit processing in the sense that learners will reflect and take their time in writing down what they want to say. So it's not spontaneous, it's not automatic. But if we really want to have some kind of idea as to whether the instruction is going to be effective, then we need to perhaps not just measure explicit processing of pragmatic meanings, but more implicit processing of pragmatic meanings. What do I mean by implicit? I mean the ability to produce an appropriate response without having to think about it, without conscious reflection, a response that is more or less automatic, etc. So if we want to investigate the effects of instruction, we need to look at the effect of the instruction on both types of processing. Now, there's a very interesting theory called transfer appropriate processing theory, which is highly relevant to what I have just said. This theory is a theory stating that memory performance is better when the cognitive processes engaged during retrieval match the cognitive processes that were engaged in when the material was encoded. Now, that sounds kind of very technical, very academic. So let me try and say what it means. It means this: if you teach something explicitly, right, then learners will be able to use what you have taught them, but only in explicit processing, right? On the other hand, if you have adopted a more implicit way of teaching something, then there's a much better chance that they will actually be able to use what you have taught them implicitly in implicit processing, right? If the way you're teaching something involves very controlled language use, then they will be able to show what they have learned in controlled language use, but not in automatic language use. If, on the other hand, you've tried to teach them in a way that encourages implicit learning, then they will be able to demonstrate what they have learned in uncontrolled language use. This is a really fundamental theory that underlies a lot of research. So now turning to my study, here are my research questions. What is the effect of digital explicit deductive instruction on the development of explicit pragmatic processing abilities? So the instruction that we decided to give was explicit, where we provide them with rules about how to use pragmatic features in order to be polite. But we wanted to see whether, in fact, that instruction only benefited explicit processing, or whether it did, in fact, have some impact also on implicit processing. That's what we wanted to do. In a way, we were testing the theory. The theory says how you were taught is how you can use. But we were saying, well, yes, possibly, but maybe how you were taught also helps you to actually perform in a different way from how you were taught. This is the design of the study. It was a very simple one. It was carried out in Japan, and it was computer-based entirely. We had two groups. We had an experimental group and we had a control group. And in week one, all the students received information about the study via email. And in week two, they filled out a background questionnaire, giving background information about themselves. And then they did a pretest. The purpose of the pretest was to test their pragmatic competence before the instruction started. And then in week three, they did two pragmatic lessons 1 and 2. And they did these by computer. And we were able to collect information about their responses to all the activities on the computer, and also to provide feedback, as we will say. The control group, of course, got no treatment. So it was only the experimental group that got the instruction. And then finally, in week 4, there was a post-test. This was basically the same test as the pretest, right? So we wanted to know whether, as a result of 2 lessons of very direct, explicit instruction, whether there were any gains in pragmatic ability. These are the instructional materials, and I don't want to read this out, so maybe you can just very quickly look at the slide and read it for yourself. Notice it says learners were free to read and work on the materials repeatedly. So they could do them again, do them again, do them again. And we were also able to record the amount of time that they spent doing the materials. The amount of time that they spent doing the materials was hugely varied. Some of them would spend about 1.5 hours doing it, and others would spend 18 hours doing it, right? But no surprise. If there's no control over what students do, then really it's back to their motivation, etc. This is the instructional materials too. Again, I'll just let you read it to get an idea. Note that all the instruction is of the explicit kind, the explicit deductive kind. And therefore, yes, clearly we did expect to find some effect on explicit processing of pragmatic features in our tests. But we did not necessarily expect to find any evidence of implicit processing. Okay. Shall I move on? Okay. A few words about our tests. We used a number of different tests in order to try to measure their pragmatic competence. Remember, these tests were given before the instruction and then after the instruction. And this is a monologic role play where the students were asked to leave a message to her host mother to ask permission to go to a school party on a day when the learner was supposed to cook dinner for the host family, right? So it's a sort of situation, a study abroad situation, where these students had found out that there was a party going on at their school, but they had promised the homestay mother that they would cook dinner that night, and so they want to get out of it, right? They want to get out of it. They want to say they can't do it, etc., right? So they had to read the instructions, and they were given 2 minutes to complete the message, and then they could click submit at any point during this 2-minute time, but they could only record their message once, right? Only once. So what do you think is this measuring? Would you say this is measuring more explicit processing or implicit processing? Remember, implicit processing is when you have to perform spontaneously, where you don't have much time to really reflect on what you're going to say, right? We set this up to try to measure implicit processing. I thought you'd like to actually look at a kind of example of what the students said. Yeah, I'm showing you a good one. They weren't all like this, right? This is a pretty good one, right? She's a bit hesitant, but she can do all the things you need to do. We actually scored the monologic role play in 2 ways. We first of all asked, does the student include all the important elements, all the important speech acts, things that they have to say? And then secondly, we asked, to what extent are they making good use of pragmalinguistic devices in order to be polite, right? And this student does a good job, right? She starts off by, actually, she doesn't do one thing, maybe not necessary. She doesn't say who her name is. She only mentions Mary, who is the name of the homestay mother. But she gives a situation. I'm at school and I'm calling you to say that I cannot able. She explains what the purpose of the email is, right? And then she moves on to provide an explanation as to why she can't do it. And she includes an apology. And also she includes something very important in this situation, which is what I call a remedy. You know, she wants out of this, but she's suggesting how she can remedy the problem later on, right? By saying that she will cook it in the future, etc. I will cook every Friday dinner for you, right? She's making a promise to do it in the future, right? one of the really interesting things is that many learners never included a remedy. They basically got as far as saying sorry, giving a reason why they couldn't cook, and apologizing. And they left it at that, right? They did not include a remedy. But, you know, if you're dealing with this kind of problem, you really have to include a remedy. We also included an elicited imitation test. And this is an example of an item from the test. Situation A, a man parks his car in the entranceway of a shop, and the shop owner sees him and comes out to speak to the man. Right? So they read that situation, and then they are going to hear audio. They're going to hear a voice saying, "Excuse me, I really have to ask you to move your car." And then they had to say whether they understood what the shop owner said, right? And then they simply had to repeat what the shop owner said. Now, all of these utterances that they had to repeat included hedges. Hedging is one of the main ways in which we set out to try to be polite. And the use of really here, really, and maybe have to, actually fairly direct, but the really kind of mitigates the force of what they're saying. So when they try to repeat this utterance, we simply scored as to whether they included the hedge. So if they included the hedge for this item, they get a point. If they simply said, "I have to ask you to move your car," we did not give them a mark, etc. We were only marking if they included hedges like really, possibly, just, etc. Okay? What do you think that's measuring? Implicit or explicit processing? Well, there are a lot of arguments about this kind of test, and they argue that it measures fairly implicit processing, in fact. Okay? Right, 5 minutes. I'm nearly there. And then there was a meta-pragmatic knowledge test, which you can also have a look at. This measured explicit processing, and this tells you what you have to do. Minke and Penny are close friends who regularly do things together. I'm cooking dinner tonight. Why not come over? How kind of you. And I normally would, but I'm afraid it would be a bit inconvenient tonight, is what Minke said appropriate. Now remember, Minke and Penny are close friends. So come on, let's see how good you are at this. Who chose A? Who chose B? Who chose C? And what about D? Who chose D? Well, either you're reluctant to put your hands up, no surprise there, right? Or alternatively, you don't really know, right? The answer is too polite, that this utterance is far too polite for two people who are very close friends, right? Close friends would never speak to each other like that, right? And being too polite is also a problem, as well as not being polite enough. And then there was an exit questionnaire where they had to say what they thought the purpose of the teaching materials were, etc. Right? I think I'll run through these fairly quickly in order to save a bit of time. This shows you the results. Group A is the experimental group, and Group B is the control group, the group that did not get instruction, right? I'll run through those because of time, and I'll just go to the summary. Well, there was no statistically significant difference between the experimental and control groups in the pre-test. So in the pre-test, they were the same, right? By and large. After accounting for pretest scores, there was a statistically significant main effect on all measures except the monologic role play pragmalinguistic in favor of the experimental group. So in most of the measures that we looked at, it was the instruction definitely benefited the experimental group. And when we looked at the gains in scores from pre-test to post-test, we also found clear support for a positive effect of instruction. But what we're really interested in is the effect on explicit processing and implicit processing. And what the results show is that there was a very, very clear effect for explicit processing on the meta-pragmatic test, which was our test of explicit processing, right? There was much less evidence of an effect on implicit processing, but there was some. There was some. It did seem to have some benefit on implicit processing as well. So summing up, clear effect on the learner's explicit processing and some limited impact on learners' implicit processing. And now I am at my concluding comments. And I need 1 minute to do it. Interlanguage pragmatics in the classroom. Like the acquisition of grammar, the acquisition of pragmatic competence in the classroom is a slow, gradual, incremental process, probably even slower than it is for grammar. There's clear evidence that the kind of communication that takes place in the classroom restricts learners' access to the kinds of interactional opportunities that they need in order to develop pragmatic competence. So you need pragmatic instruction. You need some explicit pragmatic instruction. And my study shows that this does help the development, certainly of explicit processing abilities, and maybe also to a more limited extent, implicit processing abilities. And I'm dead on time. Thank you very much.
Hello. It's a massive honor to meet you. I noticed in your first study that you were primarily focusing on young learners. I just wondered if you thought there was a difference in the results of this kind of study between young learners and adult learners, because often in adults kind of already have some more of this the social linguistic ability that kids don't necessarily have. Yeah.
It's possible that older learners could develop. It's possible. But I mean, there's a lot of research that basically suggests in a foreign language classroom in particular, even though these kids were in a second language situation, in a way, their classroom is a kind of foreign language. Because when they left school, they went back to their families and they spoke in their mother tongue, right? So I think that what that study shows is what many other studies, including with adults, show. And that is that we just do not develop very high levels of pragmatic competence. Right? And the reason you don't is because the way in which interaction is organized in the classroom means that you never have a need to actually be polite. Right? There's no need to be polite. You know everybody. In your teacher, you know your teachers are familiar with them. Right? So there's no power differential. Well, there's a bit of power differential between teachers and students, but there's really no distance between people. And therefore, the classroom situation does not create a situation where you really need to practice politeness. So you don't go. And there's study after study. This is why it's now argued, and that's the second part of my study, that if you want people in a classroom situation Can you hear me?
Yeah. It's the online. Rod, for the online participants, probably the they can't.
All right. Okay. I hate these things. My point is, if you want people to develop pragmatic competence, right, you have to start actually directly teaching it inside the classroom. You cannot just assume that people will sort of pick it up and develop it as a result of being in the classroom. Even if you're using very communicative methodologies, it's not going to happen. Oh, my friend.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. So good to see you again. I'm wondering about, when you're talking about pragmatic competence, do we consider the first language of the students, and if they're coming from a high context culture or Asia where politeness is the norm, and maybe the example you said is too polite, that might be normal in their culture, and they're just transferring these things.
Yeah, he raises what is a very interesting issue, and that is that if you come from a culture like Vietnam, does it matter if you are too polite? Does it really matter if you're too polite, right? I think that depends on the individual. You know, if an individual wants to be able to behave in a way that conforms to how an American speaker or a British speaker might speak, if that's what they're motivated to become, then being too polite does matter, because it definitely marks you as a bit strange, correct? Yeah, I mean, we get it all the time where people come and they are sort of too polite to us, etc. And it's odd, it's strange. It doesn't offend us, right? But immediately it tells us something about these speakers' proficiency. So I think it's a very, very interesting and difficult question, and there are different views there. You know, how necessary is it to perform pragmatically like a native speaker, right? Arguably, it's much more important to avoid being impolite than it is to being too polite, right? But it's really up to you as an individual. You know, what kind of learner identity do you want to create for yourself, right? Because we will notice when you're too polite, correct? Yeah?
All right, checking that you can see the slides and that they
are we can see very clearly. Now let's go.
And that's in presenter mode. You're seeing the presentation mode, yeah?
Yes, we can see it.
Beautiful. Okay, thanks very much. So again, thanks for the invitation. And I note that your theme for this conference is very, very timely. It's the future of English language teaching. And so I decided that I would speak about that very theme, the future of English language teaching, and the considerations and implications for language teachers. So I'm actually going to divide my talk into two main sections. I'm going to start first to talk about the future of English as a language. What is the future of English? And share some key ideas that are happening and some research in this area. And then the second part is going to be on the future of English language teaching. So moving from the language itself, but to the teaching of it. And then I'm going to close with some considerations and implications for us as language teachers. The first part, as I said, is about the future of English. And I'm actually going to draw quite a bit on some research and some work that's been undertaken right now by the British Council, and you may be aware of that. And I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of the British Council, and specifically Meena Patel, who's the head of research for the British Council, on sharing these slides. The ones that is on the screen there, and the next 5 or 6 slides are actually courtesy of the British Council. But I thought, why reinvent the wheel when the British Council are doing quite a lot of great work on the future of English that I thought you may be interested in. So I'm going to talk about a project that the British Council are doing at the moment called The Future of English. And this is a multi-stage program that will set a research agenda with global scope, but also local relevance over the next decade. And on the slides there, you can see what the project aims are, 3 main project aims, which is to provide insights on the trends that will define the role of English as a global language over the next decade, which I think as English language teachers is really critical for us to be aware of that. Secondly, to inform language policy and education reform interventions that will improve teaching, learning, and assessment. Again, absolutely relevant to us as language professionals. And to lay out a research agenda that's capable of generating hard evidence and data to inform those policy decisions and to evaluate their impact. So this isn't just important for language teachers, but particularly those of you who might be involved in language policy. So I'm going to share with you what they're doing in that space. And those of you who've been in the field for a while, like me, will know that it's not the first time that the future of English has been considered or documented or researched. And you may be, I'm sure you're well aware of the work of the late David Gradol, who published his first and landmark title called The Future of English back in 1997. And then his influential book called English Next, which was commissioned by the British Council, that was published in 2006. And in that book, those of you who've read it, you may remember that he examined current and potential future trends in English language and learning and teaching back in 2014, and there were 2006, and there were 14 predictions that David Gradol made at that time, and he was looking 15 years ahead to 2021. And the British Council decided in 2021 that it was a good time to revisit those 14 predictions that David had made. Of course, that coincided with COVID. So some of the research that they were doing is a little bit later than 2021, but it certainly was a good time to revisit some of those predictions, and it was a good starting point for the Future of English Research program. So this is where it stems from. So the Future of English research project is actually in 3 phases, and you can see the phases on the slide there. So phase 1 has already occurred. Phase 1 was to take stock basically of what was predicted in English Next as its starting point, and to evaluate Gradol's predictions before looking forward to the future. And the British Council came up with 16 predictions for the next decade in their phase 1. Phase 2 is coming to an end now, actually. They were aiming to look forward, and this involved a series of regional policy roundtables, and I'll show you that on the next slide, where they were able to gather insights and opinions from policymakers and influencers from all over the world, and to analyze those and to gather data through those roundtables to help revise those predictions from phase 1. And what they did was stress test them. And there were 8 themes that I'm going to show you in a moment that emerged from that. And then in phase 3, which is where they're kind of up to now, the current phase, it will develop new ways of engaging with global experts and policymakers, academics, parents, teachers, employers, all sorts of stakeholders and students, to track the trends through robust evidence-based data collection and to evaluate and interpret the trends over time. So it's important to say, as the British Council are very, very clear about, that they don't have answers to all of these themes, but what they're doing is continuing to build on the conversation that David Gradol started all those years ago. So on this slide that I'm showing now, you can see what the British Council did in phase 2 with their roundtables around the world, 14 roundtables, and all of the people who were involved in very many different areas of the world, 49 countries and territories, a number of people involved in that process. A very robust data collection. And on this slide, you can see from those 16 predictions, they came up with 8 thematic questions, and these emerge from those predictions and this ongoing research. So the themes focus on the future status of English, That's theme number 1. On what role English will play in a multilingual reality. The future of English as a medium of instruction or a medium of education, so EMI or EME, as the British Council referred to it. How will teachers remain relevant in future English language learning systems? Absolutely critical for a conference like this. Public and private English language provision, who has the answers? Can English language assessment meet stakeholders' changing needs? Oops. Can technology narrow the equity gap in English language education? And to what extent is employment driving the future of English? These are all very important questions to ask, and I hope that they are of relevance to you for this conference around the future of English language teaching. But I thought it would be really useful to share this work with you, these 8 themes. And I am going to pick up on some of them. In the second part of my talk in particular, I'll be picking up on number 4, how will teachers remain relevant in future English language learning systems? And I'm going to be picking up on particularly 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3, and 4, I would say. But before I move on, I did want to share this slide with you and to give you the opportunity to have a look at the QR code there. And please feel free to take a screenshot of that QR code, which will help you, will link you to a site and allow you to register to get a free copy of a summary of the research that the British Council are doing, and also to register to get a free copy of the book called The Future of English, which I have done and I found very, very useful. So that's really the scene setting for the second half of my talk today, which is the future of English language teaching. So in the second half of my talk, I'm going to make my own predictions for the future of English language teaching, similar in a way to what the British Council are doing and what David Graddol did. And I'm going to do it in 3 main areas, actually 4 main areas. First of all, for adult learners of English. Secondly, for primary and secondary, so that is children learning English. Thirdly, for higher ed, specifically for higher education. I'm also going to think about English and the interplay with other languages, which was one of the themes from the British Council, the second one there about multilingual education. And at the end, I'm going to give you a bibliography. I've not put references on the slide, on each of the slides during the presentation, but I do have a bibliography rather than a reference list that touches on some of the areas that I'm going to speak to. So, first of all, my predictions for English for adult learners. And I'm just going to mention where these ideas have come from. They have come from the research and from the literature, but they've also come from my own thoughts, my own experience from having been in the sector and having worked in many different countries and different areas of English language teaching over my career. So these are kind of my predictions, but premised on the literature and the research. My first prediction related to English for adult learners is something that I have seen very much over my career, which is that general English, the teaching of general English, I predict will diminish and continue to diminish, because this has been the case for many years, actually, particularly in Anglophone nations, Anglophone context. When I first started teaching, I used to teach a lot of general English, and I would teach beginners. I would teach students all the way from, if I use CEFR terms, from all the way from A1 to C2. And I have certainly not seen that in the last decade or so. I've seen a diminishing of general English, a diminishing of very high levels of English as well, and a kind of truncating of those levels, if you like. And I think that's partly because of the fact that English across the world is being taught at primary and secondary level in schools. And the EF index year on year shows that the level of language is improving, of English language proficiency is raising and is improving year on year. And so there's no more need for very low levels of English and for general English. And I think that we're seeing a move very much towards English for specific purposes, towards English for academic purposes. And within EAP, I'm seeing more of a move towards ESAP than EGAP, by which I mean English for specific academic purposes rather than English for general academic purposes. I've certainly seen that in all of the areas that I've taught. More EAP, not general English, more ESAP, so English for business for academic purposes, English for health for academic purposes over the years. And I'm also seeing a lot more of English for employability, as well as for specific discipline purposes. I'm seeing a renewed focus on English for work and English for employability, and that's not particularly surprising, I think. Also not surprising, and perhaps driven by COVID, we're seeing more technology-enhanced learning. So we're seeing differences of delivery modes. We're seeing more asynchronous and very high quality asynchronous provision, more self-paced and self-directed learning. Of course, asynchronous and technology enhanced in the longer term saves money for the learner. We're leveraging AI. And I guess that raises the question, where does that leave those of us who teach in that space? And I think what it means is that we need to be much more technology savvy. We need to be able to draw on technology-enhanced learning, perhaps draw on AI. We need support from those who have experience and expertise in that area, who can help us to develop better content. And this also feeds into the British Council's predictions, which was that EdTech and AI will advance learning opportunities. I think we're going to see more technology-enhanced learning. So those are my three main predictions for adult learners. And some of those things are true regardless of who it is we're teaching. I think certainly we're going to see more technology-enhanced learners regardless of who the learners are, whether it's children, higher ed, adults. But those are my predictions for adult learners specifically. On my next slide, I'm going to talk about where I think English is going to go and English language teaching is going to go with children and in the primary and secondary sectors. I very much think that we're going to see growth in the area of CLIL, and CLIL stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. So CLIL is where there are aims to develop, to improve English or whichever language you're teaching in, and content concurrently. So concurrent and joint aims and outcomes for both language and for content. I know that in some countries, this is referred to as bilingual education. In Vietnam, I think that's the case. And I think that we're going to see more teacher education, more development in the methodology of CLIL in the school space. And certainly there's going to be more for both pre-service and in-service teachers to learn about CLIL and bilingual education. Having said that, though, I know in many countries, Taiwan is one example, Vietnam is another, where CLIL is being embraced and where English is being embraced earlier and earlier. I actually think over time that we're going to see a bit of a retreat from the earlier the better. Certainly in places like Malaysia, where they have had more experience of teaching in English earlier, they're actually pulling back from earlier the better, understanding that it can have a very negative impact on young learners if they don't have a very robust competence in their first language, their L1, then it is not actually having a positive effect to learn subjects like maths and science in English or the L2. And I think we will actually see a retreat from the earlier the better. I don't think we're going to see a retreat from more CLIL or from more bilingual approaches, but I think we will see a retreat from earlier the better assumptions. And again, as I said earlier, in terms of English for adult learners, similarly for primary and secondary and in the school space, I think we're going to see more use of tech and edtech that's built into curricula and assessment, more AI, more engaging assessments, more self-directed learning. as I mentioned, for adult learners. Okay, my third area is in the higher ed space, and this is an area that I work in mostly these days. And like CLIL, I think in higher education, we're going to see more EMI. And EMI stands for English Medium Instruction. As I mentioned earlier, the British Council referred to this as English Medium Education. You can choose whatever acronym you like, or even ETP, English Taught Programs. There are lots of acronyms around. But what we are seeing, and research is showing, that EMI in higher education is absolutely burgeoning. And some recent research, again by the British Council recently in 2021, showed that there was a 77% increase outside of the big Anglophone nations since 2019 in EMI programs in higher education. So it's absolutely burgeoning, and it can happen at the individual program level, it can happen at an institution level, it can happen at a national level, but we're seeing an absolutely massive growth in higher education in EMI in non-Anglophone nations. So I think that there's definitely going to continue to be an increase in EMI and bilingual programs. I also think that there's going to be more of a move towards what I've called here in-sessional English language programs. And by in-sessional, I'm contrasting that with pre-sessional EAP. So much of the work that I've done in my career has been pre-sessional EAP, and by that I mean learning English for academic purposes, before students commence their award degrees. They start their degree program. But increasingly, universities are delivering in-sessional programs, which means that they develop their English at the same time that they are developing their content knowledge. And increasingly, universities are really understanding that it is their responsibility to continue to develop English language proficiency during degree programs, whether it's undergrad or postgrad, up until the point of graduation, so that they see strong employability outcomes for their students. And that's why I believe that there will be more in-sessional English language in the future. Also, my third point there is that we're going to see more whole-of-university approaches and certainly more whole-of-university policies. This is definitely happening in Anglophone nations, and particularly in Australia. For many years, I worked at Griffith University that has a whole-of-university approach, which supports students, international students, from the beginning of their degrees, and it may be through a credit-bearing unit of study, it may be through in-sessional ongoing support, it may be through workshops and consultations and drop-in sessions, a whole range of different embedded and integrated approaches to how you might support the English language development of students during their degrees. But increasingly in Australia, universities are taking that responsibility on board and developing policies to ensure that we are developing English language proficiency for our international students, for domestic students who have English as an additional language throughout the student life cycle. I also think it's important to note some of my predictions are around English with other languages, and one of the British Council's predictions was around multilingualism. And I think there's going to be more and more recognition of, and valuing actually, of multilingualism and plurilingualism, which is actually the norm in many contexts outside of Anglophone nations. There are many, many places around the world where multilingualism and plurilingualism is the norm. And I think we're going to see more of a move towards valuing that, the valuing of the other linguistic resources that both students and educators, teachers and academics come into the classroom with. And we're going to be able to make better use of that. And I remember early in my career, when I first started teaching, which is about 30 years ago now, most schools had an English-only policy. You were not allowed to speak the L1 of the students in the classroom. And even though I remember I was teaching in Spain and then in Italy, and I spoke Spanish quite well and I spoke Italian quite well, but I was not allowed to use Spanish or Italian in the classroom. I had to use English and English only. But I do think that we are moving away from English-only policies, and I think that that's a very positive thing. And I'll come back to that in my third point. But my second point there is around ELF, English as a lingua franca. And I do think that we're going to see more use of English as a lingua franca. And we're going to move away from native speakers being the gold standard for English language teachers. And I think that's a very positive thing. There's no reason why you need to sound like a native speaker or be a native speaker. So drawing on the pronunciation syllabus of Jenkins, for example, we don't need to sound like native speakers. It's really about intelligibility. And there are many functional bilinguals out there who make excellent teachers, of course, and may even be better for students in local contexts. And last but not least, I've mentioned there more pedagogical translanguaging. So translanguaging or code switching, as some people term it, is about the use of multiple languages in the classroom. So moving away from that English-only policy. But in fact, it's not just about using multiple languages in the classroom. Pedagogical translanguaging, and I know you've got a talk coming up shortly about translanguaging. Pedagogical translanguaging is actually about the planned use of more than one language in the classroom. So it's an active choice to use L1 and L2 or 3 at specific junctures in the lesson. It's not a default when students get into strife. It's actually planned to embrace multiple languages at key times in particular lessons. I do think we're going to see more embracing of pedagogical translanguaging. So what are the implications of my predictions for English language teachers? Well, I actually think it's very positive. I actually think we're going to see more demand for teachers, for English teachers, but I think we're going to see more demand for different skills, actually. We need a new generation of English teachers who can deliver on some of the things that I've just been talking about. So we definitely need, in pre-service and in-service teacher training, we need to develop those skills, to manage new technology, to manage new delivery modes, to manage new policies. So we need to develop the capacity of teachers through teacher education to deliver on some of the things that I've just been talking about. I also think that there's going to be increased opportunity for interdisciplinarity because content teachers are going to need more support, delivering CLIL, delivering EMI. We're going to need to be working with teachers of other disciplines to help them deliver CLIL and EMI. So what does that mean for English teachers? It means that we're going to need to develop new skills. We're going to need to remain relevant, to seek out those new skills, to seek out new opportunities. And I strongly encourage all teachers to be research engaged, even if you cannot be research active. I encourage people to be upskilled, to seek opportunities to do that, and to commit long-term to continued professional development. It's not going to happen overnight. I continually encourage my team to go get a master's if you don't already have one, to get a PhD if you do, and to continue to seek opportunities to remain relevant and to be research engaged. And I'd like to finish with a couple of things. One is a quotation. Again, this is Meena Patel, who's the head of research from the British Council. There's a link there to an article in the Pi News just a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, where she said, teachers who refuse to see their need to change will become the new Jurassic. They'll become the new dinosaurs and they will disappear. Sounds quite extreme, but I do agree with her view that we need to continue to change and upskill as teachers. For that reason, here at Macquarie University, we have continued to support teachers who want to develop in this area. And I've just got 2 slides to show you some of the things that we have been doing here at Macquarie. We opened an EMI centre a couple of years ago, and we run a range of programs in Australia and asynchronous programs, such as the one that's on the screen there called the Fundamentals of Teaching English as a Medium of Instruction. This is completely asynchronous for teachers who want to do this in their own country. 5 modules about understanding EMI, managing group work, asking questions, pronunciation and clarity, and using multiple languages, i.e. translanguaging in the classroom. So that's one thing that we've done. And lastly, we also deliver each year a free symposium on EMI. Last year, it was called Supporting Educators in Their EMI Journey. And the one that we ran in September this year was actually about translanguaging. We called it Adapting to Multilingual Learners in the EMI and CLIL Classrooms. And so I'd just like to make you aware of some of those things. And if you would like to know more, please do write to us at emicenter@mq.edu.au. We'd love to invite you to our free symposium next year. And we'd love to hear any of your feedback on your needs as well. So my final slide, as I mentioned to you, I didn't include the references as I went along, but that's my bibliography that talks about some of the things that I've mentioned today, the British Council's research, some of the research around CLIL and EMI, some of the history of EAP. There's a couple of references there around whole of university approaches, the Edwards, Goldsmith, etc., and the Fenton Smith, Humphreys, Walkinshaw references. I put David Graddol on there. I put the Jenkins ELF pronunciation on there. The Pi News, if you want to look at the talk from Meena Patel, and one reference to translanguaging. So really it's a bit of a bibliography rather than a reference list, but I did want to provide you with some more reading if you'd like to follow up on that. I'm going to stop sharing my
Pamela.
Slides now.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation, and thank you for ending this the presentation early so that we have quite a lot of time for Q&A. Your closing quote is quite strong. If we English teacher do not change, we will disappear like dinosaurs. I don't think that's much, but yeah, that's true. Given the challenges and the trends that you mentioned in the presentation. So having that in mind, I will leave the forum for participants in the hall to make questions for Dr. Pamela Humphreys. Yes. Question, please. Yes. Yes, I think that in the chat box, could you?
Yes, I can see the question in the chat. So the question says, have you recognized EMI implementation in Vietnamese universities differently from Anglophone and non-Anglophone countries that you've experienced? That's a good question. There is a question whether we should use the term EMI in Anglophone nations at all. And most people who define EMI exclude Anglophone nations from EMI because the definition of EMI typically, particularly the one from Ernesto Macaro, is that EMI occurs in contexts where the majority of the population do not speak English as their first language. And therefore, by definition, it would preclude Anglophone nations. I actually wrote a chapter where I took issue with that, and I said EMI in Anglophone nations, is it a contradiction in terms or cause for consideration? And I actually looked at some of the outcomes of students, international students who come to Anglophone universities to undertake their degree. And my PhD thesis actually looked at what happens to English language proficiency during degrees in an English medium environment in Australia. And I found that if students do not actively attend to their English language, even when they're in an English medium environment like Australia, their English won't improve very much. So it is something that they need to actively attend to. And there's a lot of messaging there, even for universities in Anglophone nations. But typically, we contrast Anglophone nations from non-Anglophone context. So I think you're right that there is a difference. There are far more challenges in non-Anglophone contexts because students are not surrounded by English outside of the classroom in the same way. They're not getting the acculturation. They're not getting the being able to absorb the language every day. So it's much more challenging in a non-Anglophone context. That doesn't mean that it can't be done and it can't be done well. The other question, of course, is what do we mean by an EMI context in higher ed? Do we just mean that the lectures and the tutorials are delivered in English? Or do we mean that everything in the university is delivered in English, including the extra support services? Or if you go and ask a question to professional staff members and support services, is that in English or is that in the local language? So what do we actually mean? Let's problematize what we mean by EMI in Vietnam. So I think there are differences in every single context that EMI is implemented in, depending on how EMI is interpreted in that context. So I hope that I've answered your question to some extent.
Thank you. Thank you, Josuri Ali from Hong Kong University for making a question in the chat box. And we have more time for the questions in the hall. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, we still have a lot of time for discussion. So any questions from the participants in the hall?
I know that I'm standing between you and lunch, which is never it's never a good place to be between participants and their lunch. But very happy to take another question or two if you'd like to.
Actually, in one of the slides, you mentioned that now the native speakers are not a norm anymore. It's more about EFL. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. I mean, we know for many, many years, I don't know how long, 10, 15 years, there have been more, if I dare use the term, non-native speakers using English than native speakers, if we use those two terms. There's more interaction between people who are using English as an additional language or a second language than there is between people who use it as their first language or as native speakers. And we've been moving away from considering native speaker norms to be the desired outcome for many, many years. I remember years ago, I used to work in Singapore for the British Council. I'm talking 25 years ago now. And we used to have Singaporeans who would come and take classes with us. And I remember students used to say to me, I want to sound like you. And we would problematize that a little and think, well, what would be the impact actually as a Singaporean if you did sound like me? Is that really desirable? Why do you want to sound like somebody who comes from the north of England or from any Anglophone country for that matter? Why do you need to sound like or want to sound like a native speaker? If you speak English well and people understand you, it's about intelligibility. It's not about sounding like you come from somewhere else, somewhere other than where you come from. So English as a lingua franca, ELF, is something that has certainly grown. And if you're interested in that, I strongly encourage you to look at the work of Professor Andy Kirkpatrick. You may know Andy Kirkpatrick. I had the good fortune of having Andy as my PhD supervisor for many years, and he has written a lot on the topic of English as a lingua franca. So I would very much encourage you to look at that work. But we've certainly moved away from trying to sound like native speakers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your response reminded me of the time when I first went to Hawaii, and when my Vietnamese colleague says that why you choose to learn in Hawaii, because most of the students are from Asian countries. But then now going back to SEAMEO retrack, I think that this, the time I was there benefited me a lot because I can understand the accents from different countries in Southeast Asia and in Asian countries, and that's really good. So any other questions from the participants in the hall. I guess that they are waiting for lunch. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this presentation, Dr. Pamela Humphreys from Macquarie University in Australia described a very broad picture of the challenges and the future of English language teaching and learning. So the trends and the predictions by British Council and other researchers show that, in the future, other stakeholders and technology have played an important role in English teaching and learning and also assessment. English as a medium of instruction will become a trend in the future. So this happens not only in primary and secondary schools, but also in higher education, adult learning, and also in other languages. So she comes up with the implication that English teaching is still a demand, and capacity building is important to teachers and increase opportunity for interdisciplinarity. That is really good, really interesting presentation, I think, and it's very close to the theme of the TESOL conference this year. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Pamela Humphreys, for your presentation. I want to end the session here. The certificate will be sent to you by email. Thank you very much. I want to end this session here. Have a good lunch. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for coming back after lunch. Hope you're not feeling too sleepy. I'm feeling extremely sleepy. So if I suddenly fall asleep, I apologize in advance. My colleague will take over. Okay, so this project, you'll notice, has many, many names on it. So I was the lead on the project, but my colleague and husband, as it turns out, Paul, was also part of the project, and also my colleagues Cheng Gong, Senda Dobchin, and Stephanie Dryden. So I want to acknowledge their contribution to what I'm about to say today. And our topic is translanguaging, English only and silence in the university classroom. I'm stressing there that we're talking about university classrooms here. And just before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this project was conducted, and that is back in Perth, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. They are our First Nations people that we live with in Western Australia. It's a privilege to have been able to conduct our research on their land, and which is and always will be Noongar country. Okay, and just because we haven't got a lot of time here, and I don't want to go into too much detail in this presentation, but if you're interested in reading more about the detail, this article came out this year, and yeah, you can sort of peruse it at your leisure later on if you want to. Okay, I've already shown this slide, and I can see someone already who's already seen it sitting in the audience, because I showed it at the alumni yesterday for the presentation there. But I think it's really important to show it again, in fact, so that we can get a taste of what my context, someone needs admitting, Michael Rupert, what my context is really like back in Western Australia, and I should actually say our context is really like. So although you have an image of Australia as probably very white, very English speaking, in fact, we have 250 ancestries and 350 languages in our country, which is truly amazing. And almost a fifth of the population out of 26 million use a language other than English every single day, daily. So you can see it's a very multilingual country. Added to that is the rise in our First Nations people who thankfully are trying to reconnect with their Indigenous languages. Sadly, they started off with 250 of their own languages because it's a very big country. Now we're down to about 20 which are known to them or actively used. The rest have disappeared. So because of that, there is a big move to reconnect with these languages. Also, I might add, Aboriginal English is another language used by First Nations people, which contrasts with Australian Standard English. And so in the past, there was a move to make everyone speak Australian Standard English. That has been now recognised as, first of all, unrealistic, and secondly, not desirable if you want people to have their identities kept intact. So Aboriginal English is also on the rise in terms of acceptability. So you can see there almost half of Australians have a parent born overseas, 1 in 4, in fact. And surprisingly, Western Australia, which is the most sort of rural and cut off state in Australia, there on the left side, west side, in fact has the largest overseas born population in the whole of Australia. Of course, only concentrated in the cities, really. The large parts of Western Australia are, you know, very much not populated because it's uninhabitable. Okay, so in our view, anyway, and by the way, this is all our view, it's no longer valid to see English as the first language of the majority of people studying in our Australian universities. We can kid ourselves that that's the situation, but in fact, it probably isn't. However, despite this, full advantage is not taken of students' translingual resources. We tend to sort of ignore them or just not notice them or make them invisible or just not value them, basically. Mainly, I think, because people who are monolingual feel quite threatened by people who are plurilingual. And it's their way of sort of dealing with that is to say, oh, no, we're not recognizing that. We need you to speak, you know, in our language. So English is very much privileged over other languages, which of course, because English is our national language, it's going to be in terms of assessment and everything else. But there's absolutely no reason why it needs to be in terms of the linguiscape of the university and things that go on in classrooms. There's no necessity really to demand that everyone speak in English, and moreover that everyone speak in Australian Standard English, which actually, by the way, nobody speaks in. Most people speak some variety, British English or Indian English, any kind of English except Australian Standard. It's a bit of an imaginary thing. So we believe then that fostering what everyone's talking about now, I guess, translanguaging practices can disrupt what we perceive as linguistic inequalities across the university and disparities in the university classroom. And our colleague Senda Dobinson has written quite a lot about translingual discrimination. Actually, Rod's just told me she's received an award for a publication that she's just done. So if you want to read more about that, you can get it hot off the press. Okay, so just to, and I used this slide as well yesterday, just to fill you in on translanguaging. I don't know how much is known about that. It's kind of a buzzword and one of those kind of trendy things where everyone goes, oh yeah, translanguaging, yeah, I'm on top of that. But in fact, most people don't really understand it or even trust it. They feel slightly uneasy about it. So older ways of looking at it could really be equated with code switching. That's what people understand, code switching, moving from one language to the other. And Saya has talked about this in terms of using your existing languages, whatever they are, to communicate. I don't think anyone has a problem with that. People understand that, right? What people tend to understand less is the way that this has morphed into what Kanagaraja calls the idea of languaging. Rather than using a language, you're actually languaging, which means languages are not bordered entities. You don't move from one language to another language. You are perpetually in a fluid-like state between sort of one end of being fluent in one language and the other end of being fluent in another. You're in a mixed kind of hybrid state a lot of the time. And when you think about language, we're not just talking about, you know, French, Vietnamese. We're talking about SMS, text messaging. That's a kind of language. We're talking about all the different ways that people communicate these days. We're talking about body language, paralinguistics, etc. So the idea that you're just moving from one language to another is not really what translanguaging is about. Translanguaging, according to Kanagaraja, is using all your spatial resources. And spatial is a bit of a weird word. You sort of think, what's he talking about? We're going into space. No, what he means is what's around you, the space around you. You utilize everything, your gesture, pictures, your friend, you know, hey, I don't know the word. Can you just tell me what that word is? Oh, yeah, thanks. Drawing, Google Translate, Chat GPT, any kind of AI you can get your hands on, and you use that to effectively communicate. It's not going to be one pure language to another pure language. It's bits of this and bits of that. It's certain hybridity, okay? The other thing about translanguaging is it can be something that just arises just naturally in a classroom. So people start to do a task and they just start to communicate in any way they know how. Sometimes in our classes, we don't have the luxury of students who speak the same language. So they might have one friend who speaks their language, but the rest of the people don't. So they'll have to use other ways. They'll have to find other resources to help them communicate. So it could be just contingent, allowed to arise. Or, as is the case more so now, there's a move definitely with people such as Garcia and also, what's his name, Zhongfang Tian, who are talking about intentional translanguaging. So before you even go into the lesson, you're thinking to yourself, how can I make this activity one which will encourage translanguaging, one which will encourage people to use their own languages, their own resources, perhaps bringing their own resources to the room as well. So that's the planned side of it. Now, in this little study that we did, actually, this was part of a much bigger study that we took to Curtin, Mauritius, and all around the place. But the bit we're talking about here just was really at Bentley, Curtin University, Bentley. And we asked these questions: how do Chinese students in particular, that's the group we were looking at, communicate during discussion tasks in 2 subject classes in an Australian university, obviously Curtin? And how might barriers to Chinese students' communication during these events be ameliorated? We're assuming here that there will be certain barriers that come up. So my colleague Paul is going to explain to you now about the methodology, and I'm going to step down without falling off of here and let him do that.
Okay, so the design of our study broadly linguistic, ethnographic, qualitative, interpretive, and just a word on the positionality of the researchers, as our topic really involves looking at the languages deployed by students with a first language other than English. It's important that not all the researchers are first language speakers. And in fact, of the 5 researchers on this project, only one is a first language speaker from Australia. The other 4 are all migrants. Toni and myself, first language speakers of English, but we're also migrants from England originally. And Senda and Shengong, both from other countries with a different first language. So we've got a range of backgrounds and a range of understandings about the way language is used. The participants were 2 classes of an elective first-year unit in the humanities doing an international business major, which is a common area of study for students from China. Data collection is what you might broadly call OEO, Open Ethnographic Observation, which is an approach which is very, very common in our area, moving away from the style of classroom observation that was common about 25, 30 years ago, where the emphasis was on what the teacher was doing, and there would be a checklist of behaviors and activities. Open observation means looking at the totality of what happened in the classroom, although in our case, the emphasis was more on what the students were doing during the lesson. And that involved audio recording, not video, and field notes. Also, not only did we observe the learners in their classrooms, we interviewed them afterwards to get them to reflect on what happened in the classroom, which is a common approach these days. Data analysis involves straightforward thematic analysis, but also an approach which first was identified by Balakumara Vadivelu back in 1999 as what you might call CCDA. It's classroom discourse analysis, but with a kind of critical dimension. So pulling in some of the ideas that come from critical pedagogy, people like Freire and some of the post-structural things. Anyway, on to the actual classroom interactions themselves. So the first transcript we have here is a little segment of what happened in the classroom, where the lecturer starts off with a question about racism. And it seems to meet an immediate silence. The lecturer tries again. This is a little bit maybe in the territory that Rod was talking about. When you get classroom interaction, we get IRF kind of situations. But regardless, despite the attempts by the lecturer to get some conversation, we get another silence at line 7 of about 25 seconds. We get another silence of 36 seconds at line 10. And then at line 13, a silence for more than 2 minutes, which is, yeah, and a little bit of sighing as well. Finally, a little bit of a definition after a prompt by the lecturer. And once that definition has been tied up, that kind of wraps up that little episode. But as you can see, very little verbal involvement from the students in that particular segment. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, let's go back to the other side.
Yeah.
I didn't want to interrupt, but just I'm guessing that some people will be thinking, as I was when I looked at this, that in fact there are explanations for this which may not be just what we think they are. So in other words, the task, define racism, is not something that can really be that extended. Once you have defined it, which they feel they have done, there's not much other place to go with it. I mean, that's it, it's over. So, the silence in that respect is probably quite natural. They feel the task is done. The other big thing to note here is the topic, of course. It could be that this topic has either been done so many times, which it's very possible in our university setting, that there's nothing really for students to talk about, or that they're totally disengaged from this topic. So we have to keep that in mind later on when we have a look at these silences.
Okay, so after that awkward section of the first transcript, we've got another one which starts off more promisingly with some discussion between student A and B and discussion in Chinese. And the translation there is a little bit, look, what's going on here? What are we supposed to do? What's it all about? But at least it is in the student's own first language. And then there's a little bit more mumbling and a little bit of silence and quite a bit of sighing. So the lecturer approaches the group and finds out that what the students admit to is not really understanding what it's all about. And the discussion was a little bit difficult for them. So as Toni was saying, sometimes there's a certain amount of lack of understanding about the questions around racism, sometimes possibly an unwillingness to discuss it. And also, as you would all appreciate, when you do research and you are a researcher present in the room, your physical presence is quite clear to the students. They're sometimes not sure what is expected of them. They're not sure whether they should be performing in English, because that is the expectation of the university. They're not sure if they're speaking in Chinese, whether what they say will be understood by our colleague Shen Gong, who's a Chinese speaker. So yeah, in both of those parts of the classroom discussion, there's a certain amount of silence and sighing, and a little bit of translanguaging, but not a lot. Anything more to add, Toni, on that one?
Oh, just one thing to note here is that the person in charge of the class, the teacher, was actively trying to encourage students to translanguage as well. So it was not so much a case of contingent translanguaging, it was a case of planned. So it wasn't, it would not be that they didn't feel that they could translanguage because it would not be seen favorably. It was made quite clear to them that it would be seen favorably. So whether or not they understood that, of course, is another thing, but it was a case of the over all the 12 weeks, the lecturer or tutor involved had tried to actively encourage this translanguaging.
Okay, so now on to the post classroom interviews with the students, which is often a good opportunity to find out, look, what was going on in there. You talk to the students and say, what was happening in the classroom? So the interviewer opens that line of discussion that there appears to be a certain amount of keeping together amongst the Chinese students, but the student expresses the reason behind it, which sounds on face value fairly straightforward, that it's a lack of confidence in the ability to speak English in the classroom, which sometimes creates that silence and awkwardness. So lack of confidence, I think, is something you always have to take into account. And the reasons behind all of that we'll come on to later. I mean, so how do students end up in a situation at university where they feel their English is not up to scratch and they feel shy in the classroom? Okay. Another interview talks about the diversity that might be possible on Curtin campus, and the student makes it pretty clear that they understand that when they arrive at a university like Curtin, which is typical of lots of universities in what you might call the Anglophone world, whether it's in Canada, Britain, the expectation is that students from non-first language, other first language backgrounds will communicate in English. And that communication in English starts often on what you might call a bridging course. So Curtin University has Curtin English, which is charged with the responsibility of providing some pre-course training in English. And the ideology may be too strong a word to use, but I've seen signs in Curtin English which say English only, speak only English. So when the students are doing that course, they learn to suppress their first languages. Then when they move on to their first year of undergraduate or postgraduate study, they get the distinct impression that it's not a good idea to use English in the classroom. Yeah, so it's not surprising that students who feel as if they can only speak in English and yet are not totally confident about their ability in English will remain silent and do a lot of sighing and not really engage in the kind of discussion that we want at university. So we're not really getting what we want out of the classroom situation, the kind of interaction that's needed. Again, the problem that Rod referred to before, this is what happens in classrooms. You want it to work as a lot of talking, but sometimes it's the teacher standing there waiting for a reply.
Oh, and just to add a little bit more there, most importantly, the interviewer says, so you feel that your own language is not encouraged or valued. Valued is the really serious one. And the student says, yes, yes, yes. Okay, and I guess we're saying here too that it's the student feeling they can't speak in their own language, but there'll be many other influences on that feeling. It won't possibly just be because they've been on a pre-tertiary English course. There'll be other factors, which we'll probably look at in a minute, but I can't remember if it's on the next slide or not. So I think we can fairly said it's probably some parental expectations as well as other things. So looking back then at our first research question, how do Chinese students communicate during the discussion tasks that were set for them in 2 subject classes? These students, I think we mentioned also, were students of business originally, but they were taking the units in the humanities course that dealt with looking at international business and cross-cultural communication. So that the topics were to do with communicating in Asia, communicating in a business situation. Now, it was no doubt about the fact that English language was sometimes a stumbling block. I mean, the students said it in the interviews, and it was obvious in the interaction. And they also commented that this sort of strong feeling that they had to speak in English was in part due to their experience in the pre-tertiary English language courses that they went into, the bridging, and also before that the sort of academic classes that prepared them for the bridging. But they did add that, of course, it was also their own expectations of themselves. And that's natural, isn't it? I mean, Paul's learning French and he has to speak French the whole time when he's in the French class. And there the pressure is from outside, from the teacher, but you would have to admit there's probably some pressure from inside yourself also to utilize that time that you're paying for to get the most out of it, get your money's worth, and you know, use the language that you're aiming to speak. So they did say that their own expectations of what it means to be successful in this particular context were affecting the way they were thinking about this whole thing of translanguaging, and they wanted to be accepted into the new setting. But they also admitted that, you know, that their parents had spent a lot of money sending them as international students, thousands and thousands of dollars to send them on this journey, and that, you know, they wanted to please their parents, obviously. So they wanted to be successful. And both them and their parents believed that by learning the content of their course, their business course, through the medium of English, would help them to learn not only the content, but the language. Lots of studies have been done on that, which I won't go into here now, but that's not conclusive that that actually happens. Certainly not at our university anyway. So this English-only mantra was a bit difficult for them to leave behind comfortably, even when the teacher tried to sort of reprogram them to thinking that using their own languages was okay. And we had a group of Chinese boys speaking Mandarin who could easily have communicated with each other. They were in a luxurious situation where there were other students speaking the same language. Other students might not have that, you know, luxury if they're there from the Ukraine or from somewhere else where there are no other speakers of their language. So in terms of the how might some of these barriers then be, oh, that's a big word, ameliorated? I guess a lot of you in the room might think, well, of course, it's simple. Just get their English better. Just don't let them in until they speak much better English. That's not the reality, in fact, because we take people into Curtin who have knowledge and capacity in their field. It's not just about their language, okay? And so we have to consider that. And we do set a minimum standard that is proven to be adequate for people studying in those courses. However, it does sort of not always inspire confidence in the students themselves that they're at the level they need to be. So we believe collectively that it's better to convince students to use everything at their disposal to get through this situation, to communicate using whatever means they have, and to translanguage using everything in the classroom. Of course, now in the future, that will include ChatGPT. We're in a bit of a weird space at Curtin at the moment where we haven't got a university policy on it yet. It's a strange policy where it says it's up to the individual lecturer to decide whether they'll let their students use AI or not, which is not desirable, because then, you know, if you end up in a court case or something, you're on your own. Curtin is not behind you. You've made a decision yourself. So that's not ideal. Okay, so we would argue then that translanguaging and encouraging planned translanguaging as well, not just contingent, is the way to go. So what do we believe can be done about this? Well, first of all, there's no point doing anything really unless the university comes on board with this, which I have to be frank, is very unlikely. At the moment, we have lots of policies to do with being multicultural and recognising people's cultures. You look up those policies, there's virtually nothing written about recognising and valuing people's other languages, seeing plurilingual students as a resource. The current discourse is still very much deficit. You are someone who does not speak English that well. You are not someone who has 5 languages at your disposal, who is thinking in a way way beyond anyone who's monolingual. So it's an issue, but we're working on it. We're chipping away slowly. At course level, it's probably a little bit easier. As a course coordinator, I can sort of talk to unit coordinators and say, look, can you make it clear to students that your philosophy is that using your own language is okay? Can you encourage, you know, the planning of plan your units to use materials and resources that bring in other languages, other ways of seeing the world, even if it's just the students reading those things out in their own language and then translating them to the rest of the group. At least people in the classes hear other languages. Otherwise, this is self-perpetuating. Some of the lecturers I spoke to, or that we spoke to when we were doing this study, when I said to them, you know, what students do you have in your classes? What languages do they have? They said, I don't know. I said, well, what do you mean you don't know? Don't you hear them talking? Yeah, well, I hear them talking, but I don't recognize other language. I don't know. Could be Arabic, could be Japanese. I said, so you don't know the difference between Arabic and Japanese when you hear it? No. It was pretty shocking, to be honest. So we need to have more immersion, if you like, in even just hearing other languages and also other varieties of English. That's the other big sticking point. You know, we're constantly going on about speaking Australian Standard English, but nobody in the university actually speaks that anyway. Most people have a variety, and we need to get people hearing those varieties and being more accepting of them, particularly domestic students who always say, oh, I can't understand that lecturer. They've got a different accent. And you say, different to what? Okay, what about the Scottish lecturer? Can you understand them? Oh, yeah. No, they can't really, but because that's from Europe or England, they say they can, all right? So it's a bit of a prejudice towards those languages. At a lesson level, again, you can just strike out on your own, basically, and make students aware of your stance, as we tried to, and involve students, again, in bringing in their own texts in their own languages, such as, you know, I think I mentioned yesterday, student brought in the national anthem in Chinese. We didn't have any other Chinese speakers in there, but they read it out in Chinese, and we went, oh, that sounds great. What does it mean? And then they translated it into English, and then we had a look at the Australian national anthem, and we compared what was being said. But it was great to actually see it in Chinese first. However, this all sounds like pie in the sky, and it actually is, to be honest, unless we can get the pre-tertiary courses people on board. Because the fact is, when we get the students, they've already been so sort of traumatized by being told they cannot or should not speak their own languages that it's like pushing a rock up a hill, basically, trying to reprogram people. So we need to do a lot of work in the pre-tertiary space, in the English Language Centre, basically. Oh, I think this is Paul now.
Okay, so Toni talked about pie in the sky, and I think it's important to pitch your efforts appropriately at what can actually work in these settings. So our stance is very much that monolingual universities like Curtin could really benefit a lot from using the linguistic, the spatial resources of their students, and really drive a lot more, a lot richer academic interaction in classroom settings if they were to employ translanguaging. But we know that, I think we had this thought expressed earlier on, that those of us who worked in TESOL education are probably at the cutting edge of the kind of interactions that can happen in the classroom. We're much more open-minded about getting discussion between students rather than just students responding to teacher answers. And also, we've got to be very, very clear-headed about what students come to do. They come to get their qualifications. How do they pass their qualifications? By mostly using English in their assignment work. So in the end, there's a backwash there. If the students have to do their assignments in English, they need to be improving their English in the classroom setting. Nevertheless, Sue Ollerhead's got some great ideas here. Comes from her webinar on translanguaging in the classroom, which shows that you can use what she calls a translanguaging cycle to actually drive the output in English. So there's always a payoff in terms of use of English by having different approaches to the input and processing stages. So the input may well start with English, but the processing would be in other languages. So if you have one other language in the classroom, or the students are all from a Chinese background, or you have 2 or 3 other languages, that processing stage can happen in a range of languages. But again, it comes back to output in English, and that output helps the students to improve their English and to pass their assessments. So by moving to translanguaging doesn't mean moving away from getting a lot of English work in the classroom. It just means getting a lot of language in the classroom. Another cycle would be collaborative writing. Again, the output would be joint construction of writing in English between students working together in pairs or smaller groups. But in this case, the brainstorm could happen in any language. The processing could then move to translating into English, so toggling backwards and forwards between English. And I think translations, something that's kind of disappeared a little bit from our classroom settings. It kind of has this tendency to be associated with the old world of grammar translation. But there's a lot of value in looking at the way different languages express things. So that's another cycle, again, which ends up with English being used. Another one might be particularly used around constructing the stories of how something developed. This doesn't have to be just in history. It can be in science or any subject area, because we're talking about university classrooms here, where the content would not be, it could be anything. It could be a geography class, it could be a chemistry class, it could be a sociology class, but the input could start with a text about an event in 2 or 3 or 4 different languages. The processing could then be a comparison. So putting the text together, you might find, the students might find that there are certain core elements of their stories which are similar, but each of the stories in different languages have something different to add. But again, that would lead to a compare and contrast exercise where the students say, okay, we read the text in Japanese, and we've also got a text in German, and we've got a text in English. These are all things we can compare, but there are some contrasting areas. So this enriches critical thinking as well, because it brings into perspective different cultural ways of viewing things, of constructing histories. So again, the mantra I would prefer, rather than English only, would be saying English, yes, but other languages as well.
Okay, well, we have actually finished earlier than we imagined, but that's quite good, because we would really like to leave time to hear from you in terms of questions. If you haven't got any questions for us, we've got many that we can ask you. So, yeah, we'll move on to that. These are the list of references here, very small. Yeah, if you want to know anything more and you need those bigger, you can just contact one or other of us to find out about that. But see the article 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down is the one that this talk is taken from. And as I said, has more detail about everything that went on in that study, not just what we've shown you today. So, Rod, we finished early, you'll be pleased to know. Don't be shy. We can take it. If you just say, I think, I don't believe a word you say, that's fine. We'll just defend ourselves. Oh, no, not Rod. Anybody but Rod.
Go back to the slide where I introduced the first slide was showing
The cycles.
cycle 1.
Cycle 1, yeah.
Right. This is my thought, right? That you are making an assumption that after reading or listening to a text in English, and by the way, there can be a lot of translanguaging going on in learners' minds, maybe not openly, but in their minds while they're doing that. And then you get to processing, discuss meaning in any language, right? And then you move to output, present the discussion in English, right? How do you know that processing, discussing meaning in any language is actually going to produce a better ultimate product, output, present discussion in English, than just doing it in English? How do you know? Where is the research that tells us that it would be better to translanguage in the processing part rather than just English? Now, I'm not trying to say that I believe it would be better than best English. I am throwing you a question. Where is the evidence?
I'll begin and then Paul will take over. I don't believe there is any hard, concrete evidence. However, we're not dealing necessarily with, as you are, Rod, with measuring people's performances necessarily here. It's a totally different philosophy which looks at building people's identities, retaining their identities and feeling comfortable and valuable in their own skin, which hopefully, if they feel comfortable, their affective filters will go down and they will learn more easily. I'm not the kind of, I do qualitative research, I don't do quantitative, I certainly don't do experimental. So I would never have a pre-test experiment, post-test ever, and I don't believe there are any in this field, but I'll let Paul continue. Maybe he knows more.
Well, no, there have been some studies. There's been studies that have looked, if you plan in your L1, in your mother tongue, as opposed to plan in English, and then you do some writing in English, what is better? And there's some research that actually shows that it is better to do the planning in your first language, right? There's other research that may be uncertain, right? But it seems to me that you've got to answer that question. I take your point about identity, yeah? Where is the evidence that it actually enhances people's identity? Or is it just an assumption?
Well, just to answer that one again, I think finding evidence is good. I mean, we're at the early stages in many ways of really seeing what translanguaging can do. And I share some of your suspicions that we need to be more rigorous about finding things. But I think in a cycle like this, the emphasis is less on the product and more on the process. So the processing stage per se is important to allow the students to interact. Very difficult to guarantee what the product will be at the end and the quality of that and the success. And again, that comes from not just an emphasis on process, an emphasis on what's been described these days as what you might call learning opportunities, or the trendy word is affordances. So this is an affordance offered by a translanguaging approach, which gives the students an ability to process language. But again, I think processing is possible to be measured. And if we can find a way of seeing what happens there. Measurements, yeah, how we measure it, I don't know. Whether we use qualitative or quantitative processes. But I think we need to provide these opportunities to see what happens.
I'll shut up.
That's a good idea.
Yeah,
Rod.
no, but thanks for your question, Rod. And I think it's good to be kept to a degree of rigor on this one. Any more questions?
Let's hear from someone else. Oh, we've got Lisa. We've got the other team batting now. Yay!
Not a question, but a comment. Sorry about that. No, thank you very much, Toni and Paul, for your presentation. And I think people who are here in the morning and who are here now will have seen, you know, the two sides too, the kinds of issues and challenges that we deal with when we're thinking about English language teaching and multilingual contexts. Rod Ellis's in the morning, and then now yours here. I mean, just in response to Rod's question, there is a lot of research in mother tongue-based multilingual education, MTBLE, which does show that students who engage in learning and teaching in a bilingual context actually outperform when students in monolingual contexts. There's actually quite a lot of research in that area. It's not exactly what I work in, so I can't cite you studies off the top of my head, but there's quite a lot of research there that actually does show higher achievements eventually in those contexts when you draw on the mother tongue of the child. And certainly we're seeing, I think research is growing in the field of translanguaging, where it's really showing students engaging more, performing more in class, which can only mean better achievements. And as you say, Toni, from a more qualitative perspective, a greater sense of identity, a greater sense of agency and engagement with learning and teaching. So thanks very much for that.
Thanks, Lisa. Just whilst we're still on that topic, and just still referring to Rod's question, I think it's important not to see these translanguaging cycles as an alternative methodology, as a new way of teaching. I think they're things you can try out maybe once a week. If the rest of your teaching is with processing and output in English, that's fine. But these are possible alternative ways of structuring lessons rather than a kind of new methodology of teaching.
And a philosophy,
yeah.
I'll just add to that. Actually, and just to back up what Lisa was saying, yes, in terms of children especially who are in touch with their own languages. I work in a primary school with 8-year-olds in where I come from, and definitely the children being in touch with their own languages builds a sense of, well, as one student wrote in the evaluation she gave after she did some activity, she's only 8, and she wrote, "For the first time, I feel proud and I feel happy." So that was because we'd, touched on her using her home language, whereas she'd been always told to just pack that away. And there is actually, as Rod says, a lot of research showing that children learning their new language via their first language is very effective. I guess where it gets blurry is that translanguaging is not necessarily just about using your first language. As Kanagar just pointed out, it's about using all of your full spatial repertoire or your translingual repertoire. Might not be just your language. It might be your Google Translate or whatever you've got to help you to communicate. That's where it gets blurry in terms of trying to find a sort of, cause and effect thing. If they do this, do they end up better like this? It's much more blurry. The research there is probably far less than the research that shows that using multiple languages in any situation is going to help you to learn the target language. Are there any other questions? Because we got some for you. Oh, you've got one. Oh, you want to ask yourself a question? Okay.
If we've got just a couple more minutes, one of the questions I was expecting was, how is this relevant to somewhere like Vietnam? Yeah. So we're talking about what some people would argue is not an EMI setting, not an English as a medium of instruction setting. Heath Rose, for example, has argued that EMI settings are very different. So somewhere like Vietnam, where there's an intentional movement to regard English as a medium of instruction, creates a different situation. Whereas in Australia or Canada, it's almost a kind of a reflex, you know, oh, we're in an English-speaking country, let's use English. There's no thought about it. And the linguistic skills of the teachers, the academics, are very, very different. So some teachers, some lecturers will be very, very scared of any other language getting into the classroom if they don't understand them. So yeah, so what use would it be? What use are these strategies to you? Does anybody feel as if they would be effective in the classrooms you operate in, where there's a use of Vietnamese and English?
Yeah, or even just your thoughts on it. Anyone want to comment? Yes, over here. Have you got a microphone? Thank you for contributing.
Thank you so much for your very interesting performance. I do agree about your theories, which say that it has to reduce the language inequality. Yes. And I feel like we try to create the multilingual classroom environments for our students to express themselves freely in any language. However, I wonder about whether they are using a language bridge to trans language. And I also feel confused whether they are code switching or they are translating into from L1 to L2 and vice versa. So is it time consuming? And how about the teachers wrong when they are witnessing their students speaking in another language and they don't understand anything? Okay, thank you. That is my question.
Yeah, they're very legitimate concerns, I think. And I think you're expressing also what a lot of our lecturers feel at Curtin University. They actually feel quite fearful of a whole class of students all talking in different languages that they don't understand. And believe me, some of the conversations that we actually recorded by the students when they were translanguaging were not all that favorable about the lecturer, saying things like, you know, oh, she could have put a bit of makeup on today, or, you know, whoa, look at that dress, isn't that shocking? And so it was almost as though the lecturers are kind of you know, safer in the bubble of not knowing what their students are saying. So yeah, although I guess the lecturers would feel uneasy not knowing, but in many ways they might feel more worried if they actually knew what they were saying. We didn't actually go back and tell these lecturers some of the things that we'd heard, you know. It was pretty confronting, actually. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, and again, one appreciable difference is that students who come to Australia to study have an opportunity to hear and use English 24/7, whereas in somewhere like Vietnam, often the classroom, the university setting is the chance where they can really get to use their English. So I do understand that difference. But I think just stressing again that we're not talking about replacing English in these settings with other languages. We're trying to fill in those 153-second silences with some useful interaction in any language by any means necessary to get the classroom more interactive. But thanks for your question.
To make students feel a sense of belonging, because you can imagine some of our students arrive on their own, usually on their own, to a country that is so different, coming from Beijing to Perth, sleepy Perth, where things close at 5 o'clock on a Saturday. They haven't even got outside before everything's closed. And so they can end up, actually, we have a lot of cases of quite deep depression, in fact. And we imagine that these students are all in their little groups of Chinese speakers outside of the classroom in their communities. They're not. They're often very isolated in, you know, student housing. They might be with all Indian students or whatever. So even though we imagine they're immersed in the language as well, again, often they're not, because they're not invited into the community, into the L1 community a lot of the time. They, you know, it's like everyone's got their lives, especially in a small town. They've got their lives, they've got their networks. And these students can often really feel a sense of depression. In fact, some of the interview data we got from the same people we were interviewing said it's not just about not hearing their own language anywhere or feeling like they end up feeling quite worthless. And they end up with this state that's been talked about by Rosa, in fact, a state of languagelessness. They neither feel good communicating in their own language because they feel guilty. Mum and dad have spent thousands of dollars on this. You know, I've interrupted my whole career to come here. But then they don't feel confident enough in the new language either to communicate in that language. And this sense of languagelessness is a serious mental health issue. So that's where we're coming from, I guess, not so much from the psychological perspective, but more from the social perspective of trying to make people feel comfortable, I guess. Yeah. Has anyone else got a question? That was very brave, or a comment? Yeah, do you have the microphone? We have about another 5 minutes, I think. So.
Thank you very much. I'm still in two minds about translanguaging, because I think that's just my opinion. I think it's like a deviation from the normative and standardized forms in English. And sometimes I think it may lead to, confusion and maybe errors or lower proficiency among learners. So in my situation, when I teach a lot of classes, and I see translanguaging appearing a lot in my classroom, but I'm not really confident about the effectiveness of translanguaging for students to learn English.
Mm. And again, you're speaking from a Vietnamese context, which is
that's
obviously
from
quite a different context. Yeah, but they're legitimate concerns, I think. I'm not sure about your use of the word normative, because I think anything can become a norm. It's whatever you work on that becomes the norm. I mean, at one point it was grammar translation was the norm, and then it was, direct method was the norm. So long as you get everyone on board, any norm can be changed. Whether or not you want to change it is another thing. But yeah, do you want to add to that? Oh, Rod, you haven't got the microphone.
It's all about content. Question: why did you not conduct this session translanguaging?
That's the next study.
Why did you not conduct it translanguaging? Answer: context. This is a context where everybody expected to speak English.
Actually, I can.
Right?
Oh no, Paul's gonna.
Look, I understand what you're saying. The context here is the conference, but I can think of any number of the intakes I've taught on here where I've been very happy for all the discussions in the groups, which have been fantastic, to be conducted in a mixture of English and Vietnamese. Sometimes we've had students from the Philippines here as well. So it's context, yeah. But we look forward to translanguaging conferences where everyone's speaking in a range of languages as well. Good point. Look, thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening to us and moving into this kind of bold new, possibly
new, actually.
Yeah. No, I think it's new. It's not new for applied linguists, but it's a new challenge for classrooms, and it's one which has quite a few practical question marks around it, which needs sorting out before we move forward.
Seems like this is a very interesting topic. So if you have any other question, you can approach the speakers during break time. Okay, so can you two please remain on stage? Now I would like to invite Dr. Hồ Thanh Mỹ Phương to present the token of appreciation to our speakers, Associate Professor Toni Dobinson and Dr. Paul Mercieca, please.
Good morning. I am very happy to be here. In fact, it is wonderful to be here. And coming to Vietnam for me is a dream come true. Here I am in Vietnam. I just can't believe it, because in my years of teaching English as a second language at Northern Essex Community College in Haverhill, Massachusetts, I have had many Vietnamese students. In fact, I've had students from all over the world. And I have been touched by their kindness, their respect for others, their courtesy, their hard work and academic excellence. And I see these same wonderful qualities in Vietnam society as a whole. And I see them here in this conference with the people I have met from all over the world. In fact, I'm curious to know what countries are represented today. We have Vietnam, of course. Anybody want to say and of course, Australia. But does anybody else want to mention another country that you're from? Yes? Nepal. Wonderful. Any other countries? The UK. Great. Canada. Anybody else from another country? I think I met some people from India too. So it's wonderful to see citizens of the world all gathered here together. You know, when I started teaching, we didn't use the term social and emotional learning. It's a new term, but I called it instead, and I think some of you do too, teaching with heart. Okay? And another part of teaching with heart is opening our hearts to the world. And I was reading the General English Language curriculum of Vietnam, and I was really impressed by some of the things I read. For example, I'm going to quote, "Learning is not purely a personal activity. It happens in a certain social, cultural environment in which the interaction between students is important in acquiring knowledge and developing English communication skills. This fact requires students to take on the role of negotiators with peers in groups and in the class." Wow, these words, not purely a personal activity. Interaction between students, the role of negotiator with peers. In fact, the whole Vietnamese curriculum, the whole general English language curriculum of Vietnam is full of that awareness. And you have been promoting social and emotional learning and teaching with heart already. Other words that shine in the English language curriculum are, quote, "The general English curriculum aims to develop in students the skills and capacities to become independent learners," very powerful, "taking advantage of formal, non-formal, and informal opportunities for learning as appropriate to their individual needs." Another powerful word. Students will be provided with a strong foundation of independent learning habits. And this is a sentence I love, will be well prepared to contribute to the progress of the country. So it's not just about the individual student, it's about promoting the progress of the country. And my favorite sentence is, they will develop good attitudes and feelings toward other countries, their people, their cultures, and their languages. I feel that, oops, what did I do? I feel that your national curriculum can be a model for English teachers around the world. And teaching with heart is especially important in our global society. As we know, we have a great variety of new technology to unite us. We have the blending of teaching and learning, both online, face-to-face. We promote critical thinking, social and emotional intelligence, and we try to maximize student participation so that every voice is heard. As I was looking for information on the internet about social and emotional learning, I discovered a wonderful, comprehensive website called TESOL. You might want to write this down, CASEL, with the SEL meaning social and emotional learning. And this website promotes these 5 qualities of social social and emotional intelligence. The first one is self-awareness, which is about how we think about ourselves and who we are. It includes understanding our culture, our thoughts, and feelings. So this is what we want to bring to our students. A next step that they promote is self-management. It's about managing our emotions, thoughts, and actions as we work toward goals. So we want to teach our students self-management. We also have social awareness, is how we understand others and how we learn to take on different perspective and have empathy for people. We want our students to have that quality. And the other are relationship skills. It's how we get along with others and form lasting friendships and connections. And then responsible decision-making is how we make positive and informed choices. These 5 components of social and emotional learning are what we want to instill in our students. And if you go to the TESOL website, which I did, you can take a 60-minute tutorial that shows you exactly how to teach these skills in your classroom. And then when you finish, you get a certificate. So it's very worthwhile. So also, the program is going to send you a link to a 5-minute introductory video where you can learn all about TESOL, because it's not only for the students, it's for the school, for the home, and for the community to enrich social and emotional learning among people. And they also have materials to facilitate to groups. So I was really pleased when I found CASEL website. And I want to show you just one example from the introductory test that I took to get my certificate, was that they showed you how to promote these qualities. For example, I promote social awareness when I ask open-ended questions and show interest in what my students think. So asking a question like, if you could change one thing about your day and how it went today, what would it be? That's a great question to ask ourselves and our students. It demands a certain amount of social awareness to even answer that question. And then they recommend that the teacher use I statements. I say what I am feeling and what happened to and led me to feel the way I did without blaming others. So you can say, oh, I feel frustrated today because I was having such a hard time focusing on my work. I needed to finish up. An I statement, taking responsibility for our feelings. Then we can show interest in our students as unique individuals and invite them to share about their lives. For example, I heard you recently got a job at a restaurant. Ooh, which one? What's the best thing on the menu? That shows interest in the student's life. And then we can set aside time for them to reflect on what they are learning and make statements and connections to their lives. For example, let's take 5 minutes to write about what it was like to work on this group project. How will this experience impact the way you work with others in the future? They can reflect on what's going on with them. And another way to promote social awareness is to highlight the student's contribution. An example would be, oh, I noticed how you invited the new person to sit with you. I feel that you made them feel welcome. I appreciate you did that without being asked. So just the way we talk to our students can in itself promote these 5 qualities, social awareness being an example. And the very first question that the CASEL survey asks the participants is, how do you want young people to feel when they are with you? So what I'd like you to do is to turn to a person on your right and just give that person one word or one phrase, how you want students to feel, young people to feel when you're with you. And I'll give you a couple minutes, and then I'll ask you to raise your hand and shout out your partner's answer. Okay? Just take a couple minutes. Person on your right. You might have to go across the aisle too. So, could anybody raise their hand and shout out the word or phrase they heard from their partner? Anybody? Yes? Safe. Want your students to feel safe. Okay. Uh-huh.
All of them look like my characteristic too. I
Oh.
love working with young learner. I do not like working with elderly learner.
Wow, that's wonderful. So how do you want them to feel when they're with you? Can you give me a word? For example, we heard safe. How do you want them to feel?
Cozy. Cozy. Because
cozy?
Yeah.
Oh, I like that word.
Because I don't teach in the public school. I open my own private language school. So when they come to my school, they are my children.
Okay.
So we are cozy.
Cozy. I like that word. I
Thank
come
you.
from a cold culture in the winter, so cozy is so important. Okay. Anybody else? Raise your hand and shout out your answer or your partner's. Yes? I see a hand. No? No? Don't be shy. Unencumbered.
I basically want them to feel unencumbered, as in I want them to feel able to express themselves in a safe and welcoming.
Wow. You said a lot of good things there. Did you hear him? Unencumbered, safe, welcoming environment. Good. That's good. Anybody else? Okay, there's a hand there. Inspired?
Yeah.
Wow, you want them to be inspired. That's a beautiful quality.
I think that these days students play a lot of games, and sometimes they are touched, they are engaged in the games, and I think that they need something to help them get away from those virtual worlds.
Wow, beautiful. So you have an interactive classroom. Yes?
There is the following statement. A teacher is a person who takes the hands, open the mind, and touches the heart. So I think our main duty is not to teach, but we have to facilitate, to inspire, to make them feel that they are safe when they are with us. That's all. I love children.
Wow. Your students are lucky to have you. Yeah. Anybody else? I think a couple more.
And
yeah.
Excuse me, I want something to share. Yes. I think when we do something, we try to find the right way. For example, if you want to go to SEAMEO, and you must find the right way. So that in teaching a language and in teaching children, you try to understand them, try to find who they are. And I think children has different background and different family condition. From my hometown, children from rural area, so they maybe and that's something that we need to understand children based on and we need to ask the family or their friend. I think if a teacher study more and try to think about that, I think the teaching skill will be developed and have a better, a good future. Thank you.
Wonderful. If you could put that all in one word, what do you want them to feel when they're with you? I think you used the word inspired or many other words.
Once word, I think intelligent.
What's that? Intelligent?
I think just the word intelligent, because when students are intelligent, they try to think more and more. The knowledge it comes from two field, from school and from the society. So I think if a student is intelligent, they should know that, and not also study in school, but not only study in school, but also study outside the school, because nowadays is the world of technology.
So, go ahead. Yeah.
But teacher try, because the knowledge is very large. So the teacher should guide them with the suitable for them. Maybe what will they study with
So basically, I hear you saying you want your students to feel intelligent when they're with you, right?
Yes.
That's great. I like that. Yeah. So anybody else want to share? Thank you. Yes? See if you can put it in one word. What do you want them to feel?
I'm not sure if I can use it as a feeling, but I like the word empowered.
Ooh,
Yeah.
yes. That's a perfect word. Empowered.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
Okay, so if I teach my student, I would like them to feel enthusiastic in my classroom.
Ooh.
So that means they are eager, they are willing to take part in your activities that organized by you in your classroom, and their enthusiasm will give you a motivation to create more games, more activity in the classroom.
So enthusiastic.
Yeah.
That's a great word. Okay. Anybody else? And then we'll move on. Give me one word. Yes? Okay. The person in the blue shirt in the second row. I wish I knew your names. Yeah. What's the one word? Comfortable.
But I believe that I can make my classroom feel like home for all of my students. You know, I always show my true color to them, and I want them to do the same. So we are so crazy. We roll on the floor. So I sing, I dance with them, and I always make them feel confident. This is very important. This is key to success in classroom. And my student, it's a mixed classroom. So a mixed class. So we have a different level of students. So I make sure that I can cover all the students in my classroom, and I have to get them to get, ready for all the activity. And my classroom has, to be like, it always has to, have, full of activities, and my students get so excited and active, and they always remember what they have learned today, for example.
Wow. So I hear confident and also comfortable.
Yes, right.
Very good.
Thank you.
Let's have some more words and then we'll go on. One more. Okay. Give me a word that you want your students to feel. You just have to give one word because the word will say it.
I want to describe the environment in my classroom is unique because you see that nowadays students come from different background and they come from different social position. And then you see that when they come to our class, they are all welcome and respected individually because individuality makes diversity. I see that my students, I teach them, never compare yourself with other people else. Try to be the best version of yourself. Because make compare with other people, make you hurt. Because the journey learning journey is different. And you see, they started from different background. And we all go to the learning journey. It's kind that we respect people, and we teacher can see and respect that student come from our class. It means they try their best to acquire the knowledge. And then we teachers are their friends, their facilitator, and then we all now friends. So we are unique.
So I hear the word welcoming.
Yes.
Is that right?
Respected.
And
unique.
Respected.
And you see that individuality makes diversity.
Okay. So those are very good words. Let's move on. I wish we had more time. We could spend the whole time just talking about this. What we want our students to feel. The people who had their hands up, could you tell me one word and we'll move on? Yes, one word.
Yeah, my key words are happiness and connection.
Happiness.
Happiness.
Yes. And connection.
Yeah.
Very good. Anybody else? We have happiness and connection. Anybody else? Yes. Just give me a word.
So when I teach my students, I always want them to be independent.
Independent.
Because I want them, so maybe in the future, someday, there is no teachers with them. They know how to learn by themselves. So for me, long life learning is very important.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So I heard beautiful things. And as we continue on, let's look at what Parker Palmer, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a wonderful American, I would say, educational philosopher. And he wrote this: to educate is to guide students on an inner journey. That's very important, toward more truthful ways of seeing and being in the world. He adds further. Let's read the part that's in yellow together. Everybody. Good teaching cannot be reduced to technique. Good teaching comes from the identity and integrity of the teacher. All of you who spoke today, I could hear identity and integrity in your words. Every one of you. Beautiful. He also writes, the salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the, and notice the word human heart, the human power to reflect, human meekness, human responsibility. Without a global revolution in human consciousness, nothing will change for the better. And he also goes on, as I teach, I project the condition of my soul unto my students, my subjects, and our being together. It's pretty powerful. So now we'll just take a minute, and I want you to think of an adult who has touched your life in a deep and significant way, caused you to feel good about yourself and value yourself as a person. This could be a teacher, a relative, a neighbor. Think of one adult that has really touched your life when you were younger. And again, one word that describes this person, and tell it to the person on your left. One word that describes, I think of my great uncle. He was kind, and he made me feel beautiful as a little girl. So think of something. Person on your left, tell that one word of who that adult, how that adult treated you, how that a quality of that adult. Okay, let's hear it.
Hi, everyone.
Tell me one word.
Yes, she is my business partner, and she is very supportive, and she makes me feel free, safely free.
Free?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
because when I open my own center, the question I want to, it's make me think about a lot. It's what I will teach, or will I have to change my current teaching habit style when I become from a private teacher into open a center. But my business partner, she is very supportive. She accepts all of my strengths and also weaknesses, and she is very patient with me. So I think our partner, people who are our companions, are very important because they will support us. They will make us to believe in what we are doing and what we are going to do.
So you said supportive,
yes,
and patient. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Someone else. Just give me a word. Anybody? Nobody? No. Why not? Okay, give me a word. Yeah, the person in the...
Okay, so maybe lady first. Okay, so the person I would share to you is my dad. And when I was young, my dad made me feel disciplined. Discipline.
Oh, he made you feel disciplined.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. Disciplined. Another quality. Yes? Uh-huh.
I would say a stranger. So when I was a little boy, I saw a young adult who could communicate very well English. So it was the source of motivation for me to pursue English.
Wow, a stranger.
Yeah.
And that person made you feel motivated.
Yes, because I think he tried to help two foreigners to address the language barrier with the shop owner.
Uh-huh.
So it's something that I really want to be like him in the future.
Wow, motivated. Wow. Okay, those are great qualities. Give me another quality. Yes, the person in the right here in the third. Yeah.
So I want to talk about my mother. She's also an English teacher. She has been teaching young learners for her whole life. And she always tries her best to bring out the best out of her students. She's very patient. Although the student is very low level and sometimes it's really hard for them to understand what she said. But like she tried all the time. Although sometimes she is exhausted, but like she tried her best.
So you admire your mother because she was patient.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. And very determined.
Very determined.
Yes.
Yes. So at this point, this is where participation comes in. Because when we have our students participate, it brings out these wonderful qualities and they get to know each other. And I have been working with teachers in Hanoi, Ninh Binh, La Sung, and here. And I have been so impressed by the way you participate. Just right now, I can see everybody would love to talk and want to share. That's a beautiful thing. And doing interactive exercises is a very powerful way to teach and to get students to know each other. And most of the teachers that I was working with didn't know each other. But after being in a group for 10 minutes, they were chatting away and I had to quiet them down like you have to do with your younger students. They were so excited to know each other. And I also worked with a group of teachers in Togo, West Africa. I had 4 groups of 50 students, and they went to a retreat center for 4 days, stayed there. And during the 4 days, myself and one teacher from Togo each day, we did all day of interactive exercises. We started at 7 in the morning till 9 at night, and that included meals and a film. But by the end of 4 days, they really bonded. And the interesting thing was, most groups had 50 students, 50 teachers, but 45 of them were men, and only 5 were women. So we did a lot of exercises about gender equality. And one man at the end said, you know, when I go home tonight, I'm going to help my wife bathe the baby. He was so proud. So we can really help students to have new ideas about life. And when it comes to participation, the author, her name is Emily Greenwald. Emily Greenwood Lang. And she said, a teacher should only talk 20% of class time. 30%, well, okay. But the students should talk about 80%. Now, I'm guilty of talking too much. I am trying very hard as a teacher to get my ratio down. But she has some very simple ways to start the process. She said, you know, instead of saying, everybody, I ask a question, everybody raises their hand, and then I pick a few students. She said, no, use think, pair, share. Ask the students to write their answer first, ask them to share with a partner, and then report it to the class. So that way they participate more and you talk less. And some of you are nodding your head because you already do that. And then not having the teacher voice dominate during the discussion. You know, a student says something, and then the teacher paraphrases what the student says, instead of letting the other students hear the student who speaks. And if I say, oh, do you agree with what Tong said? And they'll say, well, I didn't hear him. And so, oh, well, will you repeat it again so we can all hear you? So get the students' voices out there in discussion, she says. And then when we do reading, as teachers, sometimes we read all the paragraph instead of saying, read it to yourself, read it to a partner, repeat after me as I read each line, or let's read it all together. Some of you are nodding your head. You already do that. And then when something is difficult, and I know I'm guilty of this, when something is difficult and students don't understand, I explain it over and over. Instead of saying, is this hard for you? How could we understand it better? What do you think? Is anybody willing to try to help explain it? Instead of me as a teacher doing all the explaining. So these are just some hints, okay? Now, another humanizing effect in the classroom is teaching about culture. And there's an author by the name of John Gaston, and he wrote a book called Cultural Awareness Teaching Techniques. And he states the goal of all techniques about culture is cultural awareness. And he said it's the recognition that culture affects perception. Culture influences our values, attitudes, and behaviors. And he feels that we can guide our students toward cultural awareness by helping them through 4 stages. And the first stage, I think I have a slide here. The first stage is recognition. That's when a student says, I am Vietnamese, or I am Australian, or I am from Great Britain, or I am an American. They realize that they have certain characteristics that identify them, and then they look at people who don't have those characteristics and they say, oh, those are foreigners. But the teacher at that stage can help them to have a non-judgmental attitude toward other cultures. Then the next stage is acceptance or rejection of the culture. 5 minutes? I have only 5 minutes, and I have a lot of material. I'm going to have to wrap it up. Okay, I'll go fast. Okay. The next stage is, see, teacher talk, right? too much talking, but let's go quickly. The next stage is acceptance or recognition. And to help the student go through this stage, you would like to have them deal with ambiguity and realizing that not every society is organized in the same way. And the next stage is they either integrate or they have ethnocentrism. And when it's positive, students move toward biculturalism and they take on some of the characteristics of the new culture. They learn the language and they develop feelings of empathy. And the next one is transcendent, where we value our own cultural roots and other cultures as well. And we become citizens of the world. And I know that everybody sitting here is a citizen of the world. You have arrived in cultural awareness. Okay. I got to go fast. I just want to say that when I teach about culture, I've come to 3 conclusions. There are 3 ways to teach about it. I was in Djibouti and I worked on curriculum development. And in the 9th grade textbook, I noticed that they taught all about the culture of Djibouti using English. So that's how they approach culture. Here in Vietnam, I noticed that you have a blended effect. I took a page from the 3rd grade textbook. Let's see. Oh, I touched the mouse. This comes from the 3rd grade textbook. Okay? And it shows a blending to teach culture. So let's have the women read Linda and the men read Fung. Let's go. Go ahead, men. Or Linda, you start. Let's do it again. Does Vietnam celebrate New Year's? Fung. Yes, we do. The men. Yes, we do. For the men. Fung. Okay, Linda. Fung. Linda. Fung. Linda. Fung. Linda. Fung. Linda. Fung. Didn't break anything. I like that. Okay. And then another way, oh boy, 1 minute, or no, not even a minute. And I have so much I want to say. Another way to teach about culture is to use the culture where the language is spoken. And when I sat in my French class as an 18-year-old at the university, and the teacher showed slides of her village in France, I said, I will go there. And I did. I taught English in Paris for 2 years. And between my junior and senior year, I went to be an au pair girl and study at the Alliance Française. So, and probably you have gone to other countries when you've studied the language. Okay. I'm just going to show you this really quickly. I know that students in secondary school in Vietnam can have smartphones, and I heard that it's up to the school and the teacher whether they can bring them to school. But I just want to show you that on the internet, there are a low-tech way to use blended learning with students. This is very low-tech. And it says 25 ideas for using WhatsApp with English language students. Now, I know here you use Zalo, but it's the same principle. And give your students a partner. They can have the partner for 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, whatever. And they have assignments that they and the partner do in the classroom and at home. One example here is that the partner texts, each partner texts a paragraph from the textbook to the other partner, makes a sentence with one mistake in it, and then they have to text back and find the mistake. So you can find this kind of information online, and that's a low-tech way. And now that we have looked at social and emotional learning for students, what about teachers? We need support. And I was in Peru, and one of the teachers gave this to me to show the condition of the teacher. And look at this, portrait of a teacher. It says, finger cancer from exposure to chalk dust. Frazzled hair from bad news. Bad eyesight from filling out forms. Bad posture from, oh, it should be from bending over desks. Tacky clothing. You know what tacky means? Tacky means not very fashionable. Tacky clothing from 30 years of low pay. So, but I have a feeling from what teachers tell me here that you are well supported, and I feel good about that. Okay. And in my college, we had a program called Teaching in Community, where 20 to 25 teachers every semester engaged in observing each other's classes and reading these amazing books. Remember we talked about Parker Palmer? I recommend this book, The Courage to Teach. And another book, Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. It's a whole different approach to looking at yourself as a teacher, not from the standpoint of methodology or technique, but from the standpoint of you as a person. And this is just an example from Stephen Brookfield's book. I gave this to the students at the end of the workshop I did yesterday, and they responded very well. Let's read together. At what moment in class today, repeat, did you feel most engaged with what was happening? At what moment in class today did you feel most distant from what was happening? What action that anyone, teacher or student, took in class today did you find most affirming and helpful? What action did any one teacher or student took today did you find most puzzling or confusing? What about the class today surprised you the most? Okay, one last thing.
Jen, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. I know I'm not doing my 80%. I'm doing more than my 80%, right? Okay. You met Jerry Frank yesterday? Well, he told me something that he did with a group of teachers that I want to share with you. He said to these teachers, if this were the last day that you would ever teach in your life, maybe you were going to retire or some other incident took place in your life. Even if you were young, imagine yourself teaching your last day. What would you say to the students? And he said, on this day, you will have magic powers, and anything you say, they will remember forever. So you probably wouldn't tell them, it's very important to learn the 3 parts of the verb, right? So think right now, what would you say? And if we had more time, we would share, but think what you would say to your students with your magic powers on the last day of teaching. Okay. So, you know, when I look at pictures of you on the internet advertising this event, I see bright eyes and smiling faces. And those were the same bright eyes and smiling faces I see here and in my other workshops. And I know you have even your symbol. I know you teach with heart. It's so evident. And you know, social and emotional learning is never out of our reach. You know why? It's inside. And all we have to do is look at others with kind eyes, smiling faces, and acknowledge them and approach them with warm hearts. And the world is ours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chen Thiefels, for a very motivating speech, as well as a lot of useful and practical techniques to engage more social and emotional learning in among the students. Now we still have 5 more minutes for discussion. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Please feel free to raise your questions. So before everyone have questions for you, I have a question first. Okay. In your speech, you mentioned the 5 components of social and emotional learning. Okay. And among them is responsible decision making. So can you please share your experience on how to improve the students' responsible decision making skill through English language teaching?
The first thing that comes to mind is when I was teaching intermediate and advanced students, and we had a textbook that posed very controversial situations. And the students had to go into groups and discuss these situations and come up with how these situations could be solved. And it really forced them. You know, there were things like how prisoners are dealt with in a society. And it forced them to really, really think. And I had students from many cultures to really think about that kind of question. And something I've done here with students is I have a questionnaire, and it has 10 values, things like a pleasant life, spirituality, a world free of war, a world of equality. There are 10 qualities, and they have to rate what is the most important quality in their own personal lives, and then rate all the other qualities from 1 to 10. And after they've done that, I have them go into groups and see if they could decide as a group what's the most important. And they had amazing discussions because some people said, no, I value spirituality as number 1. I'm not going to change. But then they discussed where they had, what they had in common and what they didn't. So those kind of exercises help students toward responsible decision making, I think. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Chen. Your question, please.
Thank you very much, Jane. I wish we could stay here all day and listen to you, to be honest.
I love it.
You mentioned there more controversial topics. I think I know the book you're talking about. It might be Taboos and Issues. So I taught the same thing years ago. All right. Sure. I wondered if you so in Vietnam, there are certain topics that as teachers we are told we must stay away from. Things about religion and politics and things of that nature. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about using slightly more controversial, obviously not crazy controversial, more controversial topics to get students thinking about how they react as citizens in society.
Yeah, I'm sensitive to the political climate in my country and in Vietnam. I retired from teaching in 2006, although I've been teaching in the community. And I'm careful, especially now in the United States, there's a lot of polarization that we've never had before. And so as a teacher, I'm careful what I bring up in class because I don't want to incite that illogical polarization that goes on. So I think you're right. Sometimes we have to be very sensitive about what we have students discuss.
I think I agree. Polarization is huge in the UK as well now as well. But I think there are certain topics that we can edge towards.
Yes. Yes.
Like you were saying, when you were teaching and you were asking them to discuss slightly more out of their comfort zone topics, how they can use that in class to really kind of get an idea of I can't think of the words right now, but how they act in society and how they use their language to help them with that.
Right.
Things like that were being talked about yesterday, like hedging and levels of politeness and things like that.
Yes, that's true. And with more mature students, you can gauge what they could handle. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. You have to be sensitive, but we have to have them do critical thinking as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's delicate.
Okay. I know that you still have more questions to ask. However, our time is over. So I hope that you can approach Jen during coffee break. But now I'd like to thank Ms. Jen Thiefels very, very much for your very motivational speech with a lot of techniques that we can apply. Thank you very, very much for putting your time to make that presentation this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Hồ Thanh Mỹ Phương, for your great moderation. And thank you very much, Ms. Jane Thiefels, for your speech. And now we would like to invite Dr. Hồ Thanh Mỹ Phương to present the token of appreciation and the certificate of recognition to the keynote speaker, Ms. Jane Thiefels.